Are you feeling behind on the AI wave that has taken over the web dev industry for the past 3 years? Do you feel like it's really hard to keep up with the ever-changing landscape of LLMs, chatbots, and AI agents? Well, you're not alone. So I decided to make this course where I will teach you how to build a SaaS-like web app that will teach you how to integrate AI into your project. I'm not talking about just a simple ChatGPT wrapper. I'm talking about building a service that will send you periodical emails with a personalized AI-generated newsletter. To do this, we will learn about how to manage your AI-driven application using services such as OpenAI, Inngest, and Supabase. If you want to check the code for this project, just go ahead and click the link in the description. Also, if you're interested in checking out my new course platform, we just launched it, and you just have to click the link in the description below or go to webdevulture.com. Now that we got that out of the way, let's dive into it. Okay, everyone, so let's get started. Now, if you're going to be building a SaaS project, of course, you're going to be using Next.js in today's day and age. So I have here an empty folder that I opened inside of my code editor of choice, which is VS Code, and I want to create a Next.js app. So to do that, what I want to do is I want to run the command npx create next app. When I press enter, you will ask what my project name is. I'm just gonna not put a name. I mean, the folder's name is already the name of the project, so I'm gonna put a dot for that. Then I do want to use TypeScript, I do want ESLint, I do want Tailwind, and I don't want a source directory. I do want app router, TurboPack, no, and then it will install all the dependencies. Now, like I said, this course isn't a Next.js course. If you want to check out my Next.js course, I already have one. This is a SaaS course using Next.js. And we're going to start with the first important topic that whenever you're building your SaaS, the first thing you need to do is deal with this, which is authentication. Now, what is authentication? Well, if you're a programmer, you already know, usually when you have a website, you need to have a way to allow the users to sign into their accounts, create their accounts, and so on. Now authentication is usually coupled with a place for you to store data, because if you're going to allow a user to create an account, you need to have a place to store that data. Now, if I were to build a SaaS nowadays, I would definitely use some sort of backend as a service provider, such as Superbase or AppWrite, just because it will make your life a lot easier and it scales pretty well. So in this course, what we're going to be using is Supabase. So I need you guys to go to supabase.com and create your account. Now, when you create your account, you need to go and click on new project. Then you need to choose your organization. I'm using the free organization here, and I'm going to choose a project name. Now for this, I'm going to call it AI SaaS. Something like that, but you can call it whatever you want. In this project, like you saw in the demo, we're going to be building an AI newsletter. So if you want to give a name that correlates to that, you can do that too. Then we're going to generate a database password. I would recommend clicking on the generate password button. Then you want to choose your region. So I'm going to choose North California just because it's closer to where I am. And I'm going to click on create new project. When you're making your SaaS, it's important for you to know what kind of database you're going to be using for your project. With Superbase, we have access to a PostgreSQL database. Now, the great thing about Superbase is that even if you're not that familiar with SQL or Postgres in general, Superbase kind of abstracts all of the SQL stuff that you're going to have to do. There's just some minor stuff that we might need to write some SQL inside of the SQL editor that Superbase has. And whenever we have to do that, I'll show you guys what commands we want to put, and I'll explain what they mean. Now with Superbase, you can see that we have here a table editor, and this is where we're going to be creating our tables. We don't have any table yet, but we're going to have a place that we can store data. Now, the important part, and the reason why I even started the Superbase account at this beginning of the video, is because with Superbase, you also have access to authentication. So Superbase allows you to very easily create and integrate authentication into your project. So they create the users table for you, and they keep track of that information, and you can use some built-in functions from Superbase in order to log in, create an account, and sign out of an account with your users. So what we want to do is we want to open up our terminal and we want to run npm install, and we need to install the Superbase library. Now there's different packages that you can install for Superbase, but since we're using Next.js here, I always recommend that you install the Superbase SSR package. It is specifically made for projects that are built with server-side rendering frameworks like Next.js. Now, if you want to integrate Superbase into your project, I would recommend creating a lib folder in your project. It stands for library, and it's going to contain all the utility files for our project. Then on this lib folder, we want to create 4 files. Now the first file is going to be the client.ts. The second file is going to be called the server.ts. The third file is going to be called the middleware.ts. And then finally, we want to create a file called models.ts. Now, what are each of these? Now, 2 of them, specifically the client and the server, are files that you can actually copy and paste what goes inside of here from the Supabase SSR documentation. They are the files that allows us to create the function that we will then use throughout our project to access and execute operations in Superbase. Now it has a client and a server version because when you are inside of a client component in Next.js, you'll use the client version, and when you're in a server component or in a server file, you'll use the server version. Now what do you put inside of them? Well, for the client, we want to put this. This over here I got directly from the Superbase SSR documentation, and what it is it calls the create browser client function from Superbase, which is the function that allows you to create an instance of Superbase in the client, and then it exports this create client function. So everywhere in our project, specifically if you're in client components, we can do this. We can say const Superbase is equal to create client and call this function. And we'll have an instance of Superbase, which we can then use to add stuff into our database, delete stuff, read stuff, and so on. You might have noticed that it doesn't require an async await. That's the most important part, because then we can just call this instance at the top of a client component and have access to Superbase. Perfect. Now we want to go to the server. Now for the server, we want to paste this code over here. This code, again, I just copy and paste it from the Superbase documentation, and it handles all of the server-side stuff related to cookies and authentication when you are creating an instance of Superbase in server components or in server files. Now, the main difference here is that you can see that this is an async function. So more specifically, because they need to get access to the cookies. So whenever we call this in a server component, we'll have to do something like this. We'll have to await and call the create client. So that's the main difference. Now you can access both of them either from my code base or from the Superbase documentation I'll leave below, but it's important to always have both of these files set up in your project right in the beginning. Also, you might have noticed that we have here a couple environment variables. Now, environment variables are extremely important because they allow us to put credentials for external APIs and services without having to directly write the code and thus maybe exposing it when we push our code to GitHub, for example. So we need 2 specific variables that are given to us. So we need a public Superbase URL and a public Superbase anonymous key. So all we need to do is we need to create here a .env file. I'll specifically make a .env.local file, and I'll paste both variables over here. So we'll go here again, and we'll paste this. Now, where do we get the values for them? Well, if we go here to our Google Chrome, we go to the project overview. Down here, we should see that to connect this project that we created in the Superbase website with our code, we just copy the project URL, we paste it over here, and we just copy the API key, and we paste it over here. And this will allow us to successfully connect our project with our code. Now, let's close both of these, and let's go to the middleware. The middleware, similar to the client and the server, is also a file that you don't need to write things yourself. It's already written for you. And what you want to paste there is this. This will allow you to set up your middleware that has access to Superbase and will kind of replace the middleware file that usually exists in a Next.js project. Now, if you're not familiar with the concept of middlewares, we're going to work with them later on in the project. But the idea is that you can write some code that goes in between each route in your project and gives you the opportunity to either reject a route or let the user go to that route. So for example, if we have a page, such as in this project, we have a dashboard page, we might want to gate that page based on if the user is logged in or not. So in this middleware, what we can check is, is the route that the user trying to go the dashboard page? If it is, let's check to see if the user is logged in. If it's not, we redirect them somewhere else. So it's a layer that stays in between when a user changes route in their project. And Supabase requires us to have this middleware.ts file, which will now become the new middleware.ts file that we usually create down here. So in a Next.js project, you need to create a middleware.ts file that is outside of all the folders. And on this file, since we are not going to be writing any of the middleware logic, we also want to paste this. This, again, I copied directly from the documentation. It calls the update session function that we have here in this middleware.ts file from Supabase. Also, since I copied it from the documentation, it doesn't make sense. The path in our project, the path looks like this. It is in the lib folder, then it's in the middleware file. And we just return this. Now, if we go here to the middleware, you see that there is one part of the middleware that is being shown as an example, but we want to remove it. Now, it assumes that all of the pages or routes in this project that isn't the login or the auth route are going to be gated, and it redirects the user based on that. So we don't want to do that. We don't want to have any middleware redirecting for now. So I'm going to comment that out. So we can close all of this off, and I know that was a lot to begin with, which, by the way, we didn't do anything with the models, but we'll do that later in the project. I know this was a lot to begin with, but we got a lot of the setup out of the way, and we can get started on building the website. Now, how is our website going to look like? Well, let's actually run the code first. I'm going to do npm run dev, and we should see that if I go here to our localhost 3000, now it should show the project running. Now we are in the home page, so the index route. And what I want the project to have is actually, I don't want to do anything on the index route. I want to have 3 routes in this project. I want to have the sign in page, which doesn't exist right now. Then I want to have the dashboard page, which you are using it to handle your newsletter subscription. So for example, you can update your preferences, change your like how many days in a week you want your newsletter to come in through, and so on. And also we're going to have the select route, which allows you to select the different categories that you want your newsletter to be about. And primarily those are the 3. We also want the subscribe one, which is just a route that will allow you to pay for our services. So those 4 routes are the essential ones. So initially, when you log into your project, into the project, we actually want to redirect the user to the dashboard page since we're not having a home page. Now, how do we do that? Well, we're going to come over here. We're going to go to the app, and the home page is rendered on this page.tsx. Now, there's a bunch of stuff here that we don't really care about, so I'm going to actually delete all of these. And what I want to do is I actually want to return null. And the reason for that is because there's nothing we want to render on the first page. But rather, what we want to do is we want to redirect the user to the dashboard page. So I'm going to go here to our middleware.ts in the lib folder. And in here, which by the way, we're not doing anything with it, we want to write a check. We want to check if the current page is the home page. So if the request.nextURL.pathname is equal to the empty route, so the first route, then what we want to do is we want to return a next response.redirect. And where do we want to redirect? Well, what we can do is we can do this thing over here in which we can get a URL, clone it, and then change the path name to something else, like the dashboard page. And this way, what we do here is if the user tries to go to the home page, they immediately get redirected to the dashboard page. You'll see that now I should already be in the dashboard page because I was in the home page and I'm never allowed to go to the home page. Great. So let's start building the dashboard page, or at least make the file for it so it doesn't give this 404 error. So to do this, I'm going to create here a folder. Let's call it the dashboard, and then dashboard. And then inside of this dashboard, we want to create a page.tsx. Now in this page.tsx, we want to do something super simple. We just want to export default a function called dashboard page. This will allow us to return some sort of UI that will differentiate this page or this route from others. For example, I'll just render the text dashboard. And when I come over here, you should see that we have the text saying dashboard. Perfect. Now let's create the route for the sign-in, because to make this dashboard, we first need to start with the sign-in page. And like I said, we're starting this course teaching you authentication. So we want to create here a folder called sign in. Inside of it, I also want to create a page.csx, so I'll just copy that. But in the sign-in page, we want to call this sign in page. And let's just delete this div that we have over here. Now, what do we want to render on the sign-in page? Well, we want to render a simple page that will have the ability to sign in a user or sign up a user. And then if they are authenticated, they shouldn't even have access to this page. Now, I actually ran the project that I already built, the one that I showed in the demo, and it's this over here. And this is the page we want to build. So how do we make that happen? Well, first of all, I want to return here a div with a div inside of it. Then I'll put another div, but this div is going to be for the title of the page. So let's say personalized AI newsletter. And we should see that this, when we go to this sign-in page, it should say this. Perfect. Now, I want to put here a p tag below this that will say sign up or sign in to your account. But this will actually change depending if the user is trying to sign in or sign up. We're going to use the same page for both functionalities. Then below this div, let's create another div which will have a form. Now this form is for the inputs that will exist for a user sign up. So what are the inputs? Well, we need an input for the email and an input for the password. So if we go here, we can put an input here for the email. So I'll make it have an ID of email, and it will have a name of email and a type of email. Then we also want to make it required. So I'm going to put required here, and this should be good to go. Now I'm going to come here and I'm also going to put a label, and a label will just help us identify what this input is. So it will say email address, and usually the label should go above the input. Perfect. So currently we have this input. It's kind of invisible because of the styling, but we're going to add some styles in a second. Then we want to add the password field. So I'm going to come over here and I want to add another one. It's going to say password. And then in the input field over here, we're going to change this to password, then this to password, and this to password as well. Now, both of them, I want to wrap them around with a div so that we can then style them later. Remember, this video is not about styling. I even wondered if I should have been showing you guys how to build each individual component like I'm doing, just because I want you guys to mainly focus on learning the workflow of the different parts of when you're building an AI SaaS or just a SaaS in general in today's day and age. Not the specifics of building a component, because that's an assumption that I have when you're watching this video that you're already familiar with this kind of stuff. So with this, we have now an input for the email and an input for the password. Now what we want to do is we want to add a div below this, and this div will contain the button for submitting the form. So I'm going to have a button, and this button will contain the message saying sign in, and the button will be of type submit. Perfect. Now we also want to have a way to change the user's sign up functionality. So what do I mean by that? Well, right now the user can only sign into their account, but I want to have a button that will allow the user to click on it and then switch between trying to sign in and trying to sign up. Now to do that, I want to come below this form and I want to create another div, and this div will contain a button. Now this button will say something like this: don't have an account, sign up. And what this will do is when you click on this button, it will look like a text, as you can see over here. When you click on it, it actually swaps all of the text to, instead of saying sign in, it says create your account. And then you can click again and swap it back if you want to. So to do that, I want to have a state that is going to control what we're trying to do in this component. Are we trying to sign in or are we trying to sign up?
So what I want to do is I want to create here a state called is sign up, and set is sign up. It's a use state, and this state will be false by default. Now, what this will do is, if it's false, it means that you're not trying to sign up. If it's true, it means you are. So when you click on this button, we wanted to actually swap the value to whatever it is right now. So if it's false, we want it to become true. And if it's true, we want it to become false. Now, how do we do that? Well, we get the current value or the previous value, and you just set it to the opposite of that. And meaning that if this is false by default, which means the user is not trying to sign up, then when we click on that button, the UI will change, or the state will change to say that the user is trying to sign up. Now, we do have an error over here, and it's because in the sign-in page, it's mostly client-side stuff, because we have a state over here and we have a button with interactivity. When that's the case in Next.js, this has to become a client component. So to make it into a client component, we have to make the use client appear at the top over here. Now, nothing really happens when I click on this button. Yeah, the value of the state is changing, but the UI isn't really changing to adapt to it. So the first thing I want to do is, on this p tag over here, I want to switch it. So if the user is trying to sign up, instead of saying sign in to your account, I wanted to say something else. So I wanted to say create. So create your account. And you see that now when I click on this button, this text should change. See, and when I click again, it should go back and then keep moving. Now, the second thing that should change is the text of this button itself. Instead of saying don't have an account, sign up, it should say something like already have an account, sign in. So we'll go down here, we'll write the same logic of checking to see if sign up is true. If it is, then we want to change this to say already have an account, sign in. And I'll just capitalize this I to make more sense. So now when I click on this, this swaps and the UI will change with it. Now let's make it look less ugly. So to make it look like less ugly, what I want to do is actually, I want to copy and paste all of the TailwindCSS classes that make up this component. You can have access to those classes in the description, or you can just copy from what I will paste over here. And again, I'm not showing the styles just because I feel like it will be a waste of time. This isn't a TailwindCSS course. So I'll be back in a second when the styles are pasted. Perfect. So I just pasted over here. You can check out all of the class names for all the stuff that I added. And I also added one thing is on the submit button, I forgot to do the little switch up where you switch between saying sign in and saying create account. But just through the styles that I have here on the screen, the page already looks exactly like how we wanted it to. Now, what we want to do is when you want to authenticate a user, you need to keep track of what the user is typing on the inputs. So I'm going to come up here and I'm going to create a state that is going to keep track of the email and one that is going to keep track of the password. So let's create a set email and email. We're going to say use state and it's going to be a string. Then we're going to copy this and we're going to create here the password field. So we'll change this to set password and it will also be a string. Now we'll then come to our inputs. We'll start with the email address one. I'll put the value to be equal to email, and then I'm going to detect when there's a change on this input. And when there's a change in this input, I want to set the email equal to event.target.value so that I save the value of what the user is typing on this input into the state. Then I'm going to copy this. I'm going to go to the password field and we're going to do the exact same thing, but instead of saying email, we're going to say password. And we're going to set the password equal to that. Now, what are we going to do with this password and this email? Well, we need to do something when the user submits the form. So when a user clicks on this sign in or create account button, we need to do something with that data. Now, to do it, we're going to create here a function. It's going to be called handle auth. And we're actually going to make it into an async function that takes in an event. And this event is going to be of type react.formEvent. So this function is actually called when the user submits the form. So when they submit, so the on submit, we pass the handle auth. And when they submit, we want to do the following. So first thing, we need to prevent default. If you're not used to working with forms, this is essential so that the page doesn't refresh when you submit the form. Then we want to do a try and catch. So let's try and catch the following. So I'm going to write the catch case over here. And what we want to try is, we want to try to either sign the user up or sign the user in. Now, how do we differentiate? Well, we know that we have that is sign up state. So we're going to make an if statement that will help us distinguish both logics. So if is sign up, we want to sign the user up, else we want to sign the user in. So let's start with the sign up. How do you allow a user to sign up? Well, with Supabase, it's actually pretty simple. You just await Supabase, but we don't have access to Supabase. What we need to use is one of the options that we created over here, either the client or the server, because they have a create client function that gives us access to Supabase. Now, which one do we use? Well, remember what I explained. If you're in a client component, you use the client, and if you're in a server component, you use the server. In this case, this is a client component. So I want to come over here and say const Supabase is equal to create client. Now we choose the client version, and we now have access to Supabase. Now in this Supabase variable over here, we want to say Supabase dot, and then since we're working with authentication, in Supabase, it's super easy to do anything auth related. You just access the auth service in Supabase, and they have a bunch of functions that are super useful for us, such as the sign up function. Now the sign up function requires us to pass two pieces of data. It requires us to pass an email and a password. Good thing we already have those. Now, when we sign up a user, we actually get back some data. More importantly, we get back an object that tells us if there was any errors in the sign up process. Now that's important because if there's an error, then we actually want to throw that error. And also, we know that when a user signs up for an account, Supabase actually does the great thing of sending an email for confirmation to their email account. So you actually need the user to confirm their email before they can actually log into their account. So one thing I want to do is I actually want to create a state over here called message. And this state will have a little message that we can write and display to the user. So we'll say set message. And then when the user signs up, if like after we check to see if there's an error, if there isn't an error, I want to set a message to say check your email for the confirmation link. Great. And then we can display this message somewhere in our page. More importantly, I'll display it above the inputs. So right over here, I want to check, okay, if there is a message, then I want to display the following UI. I want to have a p tag that says message and then displays the message that we sent. So I also want to put some styling to this. So what I want to do is I'll just copy and paste the styling directly here. It's very minimal. It's just to make it, it's a positive thing. We're receiving this message, so I made it green. And you'll see that if I just make this true and I were to copy this and make this the default value of message, this is how it would look like after you sign in. It's just a little text saying, check your email for confirmation link. Now let's go back to the default value and let's not make it true always. So it only shows when you do set a message. And now what I want to do is I want to put an else statement over here. And I want to write the logic for allowing a user to sign in. Now, when they sign in, it's a bit different. We still have the same structure because we're still calling Supabase off. But instead of calling the sign up function, we want to call this function called sign in with password. Now, the sign in with password also requires an email and a password. But when it's done, we don't want to set any messages because when you sign in, you want to be redirected to the next page, meaning in this case, the dashboard. So what I want to do here is I want to have a way to redirect the user when they sign in. Now, the easiest way to do this is by using the use router hook from Next.js. So I'm going to call the use router hook. Make sure you import that from next navigation, not next router. And I'm going to run router.push. Now, when you push something to the router object, you can specify a string over here, and this string will force the router to redirect the user to whatever path you put here. So in this case, when the user logs in, we want to redirect them to the dashboard. So let's check to see if this is working. I'll come over here. I'm going to try to create an account. I'm going to use an email that I always use in my videos just to test this. It's called PedroTech resumes. And then I'm going to put @gmail.com. Then I'll put a password. So I'm just going to say password 123. And I'm going to click create account. If this is successful, we should see check your email for confirmation link. Now let me sign into that email and let's check it out. Awesome. So as you can see, we have here the Supabase auth email that we just received. I'm going to click on confirm your email and look what happened. We've been redirected to the dashboard. Let me try going to the sign in page. Are we logged in or are we not? So we are already logged in. Now, how do I know if we're logged in? Well, we don't have any logic here to check to see if the user is logged in or not. So we can do that. But when you click from the email here, directly to confirm your email, it actually opens up an instance of the project in which you are already logged in. So we can actually write code that will prevent the user who's already logged in to be able to access the sign-in page. And also we can write some code that will prevent the user to go to the dashboard if they're not logged in. How do we do that? Well, we're going to come here to our Middleware.ts file. And similar to how we have this logic here to redirect the user, we can do the same thing for the other routes. For example, let's try to prevent logged in users to go to the sign-in page. To do that, we'll change this path name over here at the top because we're checking to see if the user is in the sign-in page. That's what request.nexturl.pathname means. And then where do we want to redirect them? Well, we want to redirect them to the dashboard if they're logged in. How we have it right now, we'll redirect them to the dashboard no matter what. So if I refresh this, now I'm in the dashboard. We don't want that. We want to check to see if the user is logged in, and only if they're logged in, we want to redirect them. Now to check that, we'll use the example that was already here that we got from Supabase. We can uncomment this, and this logic over here, when you say supabase.auth.getUser, it actually tries to get the user who's logged in, and it returns that data through this object called user here. Now, if user is null, it means the user is not logged in. So what we know here is that if the user is not null, then we want to redirect the user. So what we're doing here is, instead of actually putting this if statement here, let's just do this. If the user exists, so the user is logged in, and they are trying to go to the sign-in page, then redirect the user to the dashboard. So now let's test that again. Let me go here to sign in, and then let me try signing into my account. I'm going to put the same email. So PedroTech resumes @gmail.com. I'll try to use the same password I used to create the account. And when I click on sign in, I should be redirected to the dashboard. And yeah, that's exactly what happens. But not only that, when I go here to the sign in page, I shouldn't be able to access it. You see now it prevents me. Why? Because it knows we are authenticated and it doesn't allow the user to. Also, you can check to see your users by going here to authentication, and you see each of the users will appear here as you create accounts with them. Now, what do we want to do? Well, the first thing I want to do is actually want to just add a navbar to our project. The reason for that is if I want to test any functionality of logging out to show you guys, I want the navbar to already be there. So to do that, I actually want to create over here a folder called components. Now we're not going to really have that many components in this project, so it's really just this one navbar component we're going to create. And we're going to create this navbar.tsx. And I'm just going to paste the navbar here because writing a navbar isn't part of the scope of this course. So here is what we have. We have here an unfinished component that I want you guys to just copy and paste here as well. What this component is a component that should do the following. It should allow you to log out from your account. Thus, we have here the handle logout button, but it should also show the user's email. Now, currently it doesn't do that. It just says welcome, but it should show the user email over here. Now, we are not calling this navbar anywhere, so I want to call it inside of our layout.tsx file so that it appears no matter what on top of each of the routes. So I'll call the navbar component over here. And now you should see that if I go here, it will always appear at the top. Now, again, the functionality of logging out and the functionality of showing the user's email for the user who's logged in is not working. Now, the reason for that is because we actually want to create an easy way for us to share the information of whether or not the user is logged in or not throughout our entire project. An easy way to do this is to actually create a context that is going to provide this data to every single route in our project. So in here, I want to create a folder and I want to call it contexts. And in this project, we're only going to create one context, but I'll put it inside of this folder and we're going to call it the auth context. Now, if you're not familiar with the context API, I highly recommend watching a video on it because we're going to go a little bit faster through it. But basically, we want to create a context that is then going to have a provider, and that provider is going to provide data. Now, what kind of data do we need? Well, this kind of data. So in multiple routes in our project, we need to have access to the user, the session, if the data for the user is loading, and also have access to the sign out functionality. Now, this type is going to be for the context called auth context. So we need to import the create context function from React. And also, you see the user and the session types. What are those types? We haven't made those types, but we don't need to because Supabase actually provides those types for us. But the thing is, the Supabase SSR function or library doesn't provide that for us. We actually can get those types directly from the Supabase/Superbase.js package. Now, when I install that, we can now import the user type and the session type. Now, this auth context is going to serve this data. So how are we going to serve this data? We're going to create a auth provider that we're going to wrap our entire project within. Now, this auth provider is going to have a prop, and the prop is going to be children because it is a wrapper component. And the type of children is going to be React Node. Now, at the end of this provider, as all providers go, we will return an auth context.provider and we'll render the children. Now, since this is a provider, we need to pass here a value. Now, the value is going to be equal to this object that we're going to create over here called value. It's going to be an object, but we haven't passed anything to it yet. And we'll just pass it over here. Now, what do we want to do for this auth provider? Well, remember, we want to provide the user information, the user session, if the user data is loading, and a sign up function. So to get the user information, we'll start by creating a state called user. And we'll create a set user function. Now, the type of this state is going to be either the user type that we imported from Superbase.js or null. Now, when is it null is when the user is not logged in or if the data hasn't loaded yet. Because remember, to fetch the data of the user, it takes a bit of time, right? A very small amount of time, but there's an in-between there. So for the sake of that in-between, we don't want to run into conclusions that the user isn't logged in just because the data hasn't fetched yet. So it's important for us to keep track of if the data is loading or not. So I'm going to create a loading and a set loading. And initially, the loading state is going to be equal to true. Because when we do get the data for the user, we'll then set that to false. Then we also want to keep track of the session. So I'll create a state here called session. Again, same thing with the user. It's going to be null by default. And finally, we're going to be doing some stuff with Superbase. So we want to come here and say const Superbase. And we're going to set it equal to create client. Now, which version do we want to use? Well, we're doing a bunch of React stuff here, such as creating a provider and a context. So this has to be a client. And this file, this component, has to also be a client component. Now, let's build the logic for getting the user who's logged in or not and setting this state equal to that. So that we can then pass this value down here together with the session and the loading, and then eventually pass the sign out. So to do that, I actually want to run a use effect. Now, why are we running the use effect? Because this use effect is going to run whenever this component or this provider is loaded initially. So right when it renders, we're going to run this function. So what do we want to get from this function? We're going to get the current session. And to do that, I can do this. I can say Superbase.auth.getSession. And for the sake of not having to create another function and make that async so that I can use async await, we're going to be using a .then approach. So this get session returns a promise. So I can then say .then, and this will return us back an callback function. And the argument of this callback function will have the value for the session. It will be inside of a data object called session. And then when we get the session, we want to set the session equal to the session object. We're going to set the user equal to session.user. But if that's null, then we want to default the user to null as well. And then we want to set loading to false because it loaded all the data and we don't need it to be true anymore. Now we have the ability to know if the user is logged in or not, because we run this functionality right when the component renders. And if it finds a session in this get session, it then sets that value here. Now, previously we used a get user, as you can see over here. Now, what is the difference? Well, there's a difference between get user and get session. And the main idea is that get user is more secure because it actually makes an HTTP request to Supabase to validate the JSON web token that you have in your storage. So when you sign in, you store a token in your local storage. And what happens is that token determines if you're logged in or not. Through the get session, we can, what it does is it just reads the token from the local storage without actually validating it in Superbase. So it is a little bit more insecure, but we're creating this auth context here for more of UI stuff. When we do make changes to the backend, we're always going to double check by using the get user. So mostly in the front end, I'll be using the get session, but then in the backend, I'll be using the get user because it's more secure and it actually validates the JSON web token. Now, what do I want to do? Well, we have the value for the user, the session, and the loading, but we don't have a function to assign the user out, which is exactly why we even created this. We want to have a sign out function to put on the navbar, right? So we'll create this function. It's going to be an async function. And the functionality to sign out in Superbase is actually pretty simple. All we have to do is we just have to say await superbase.auth.signout. And the sign out function will sign out the user. We'll then pass this sign out property here. And as you can see, we should be good to go. Now let's pass this auth provider so that it actually serves this data all throughout our project. To do that, I'll come here to our layout and I'll wrap this entire thing with the auth provider, make sure the children is within it so that it accesses it as well. And then I'm going to import that value from the auth context.tsx that we just created. Now in this navbar over here, if I want to know if the user is logged in or not, all I have to do is I just have to access the data through the context. But an easier way to do this, instead of having to use the use context every time and exporting this auth context, if you're familiar with the context API, you'll understand what I'm talking about. An easier way is to actually create a hook inside of here. We'll create this use auth hook that just calls the use context hook and it just returns that context data. So that now all we have to do is in this navbar.tsx, I just have to call the use auth hook, and in here we can then get the user back if we need it, such as in this case over here. Other situation in which we might want the user is in the part of the navbar that we showed the user's email. So in here I can come and display user.email, and that should actually display the correct information. So we're correctly getting the data for the user, as you can see, because it showed the correct email. Now the last thing we need to do here is allow the user to sign out. So I'll just uncomment that and we'll get the sign out functionality from the use auth, and hopefully it should be good to go. Where as I click on this button, we should get redirected to the sign in page. And that doesn't seem to happen. Let me refresh this. Wait, what happened? The navbar disappeared. So, but it didn't happen immediately. Let's try going to the sign in page, because if we are still signed in, we shouldn't be able to access it. But as you can see, we are able to sign in or go to the sign in page, meaning that we didn't correctly sign out. But there's an issue with this, because if we were able to sign out, when we click that button, why didn't it automatically redirect us? And why didn't the UI automatically update? Because the navboard disappears if the user is not signed in, right? This is why in the navboard over here, we return null if the user is not logged in. The reason for that is very simple. In this auth context over here, we set the value of user to whatever we get from the session. But if the user logs out, we never update that state to now be null. So what we could do is we could come over here and say set user to null. But a more reliable way to do this is to use the onAuth state change function from Supabase. So what this is a subscription that you can subscribe to in Supabase. I'm going to say supabase.auth, and I'm going to access the onAuth state change. And in here, we can have access to two things. First, an event, and then the session. Now, whenever there is a change in the user session, this function over here, this callback function, will be called. So this will be called if the user logs in, and this will be called if the user logs out. And if that happens, this session variable in this callback function will update. It will have the new updated version. So if the session is null, now we can just set everything like we did over here back to its value. So it's kind of a way, this runs only once, but then this runs every time there's a change after that. And obviously, since this is a subscription, we need to clean it up. So I'm going to get the subscription value over here. We are subscribing to it right now, but to prevent memory leaks in this use effect, so if the component unmounts and we're still subscribed, that's a bad thing. We actually want to make sure that when the component unmounts, we unsubscribe to it. So I'm going to come over here and I want to return a subscription dot unsubscribe. And this will unsubscribe to this. So if you should think of this as just every time there's a change in the user's auth state based on Supabase, this will run and we will update the values of our state based on that. So now, if I come over here and I sign in, so I'll try to sign in again. As you can see, I'll click sign in. We show up, it shows the navbar, great. Now when I click log out, we get redirected to the sign in and the navbar disappears. So this is pretty much it for authentication. The only really thing that we want to do left is make sure that we gate the dashboard page similar to how we gated the sign-in page. So to do that, we go to the middleware.ts file, and in the sign-in page, see how we are checking to see if the user exists when they try to go to the sign-in. And if you're logged in, we don't allow you to go to the sign-in route. We want to do something kind of similar, but kind of the opposite. We want to check to see if the page is the dashboard page. And if it is the dashboard page, but the user doesn't exist, meaning the user is logged out, we want to do the opposite. We want to redirect the user to the sign-in page. So you'll see that now when I come over here and I try to go to the dashboard page, it doesn't allow me to, it takes me to the sign-in. So when you're working with setting up your authentication, there are 5 pillars that you need to make sure. So one of the pillars is signing in and creating your account. The other pillar is when you have a user signed in and created their account, you want to keep track of that data. So that's what we did with the auth context. It's an easy way for us to know if the user is still logged in or if they're changed their information. Then you also want to know if the user logged out and give that ability to the user, which is what we did over here. And finally, you want to gate some of your pages based on the user sign-in. And that's where the middleware comes in, where we get the information of if the user is logged in or not. Remember, this is all running on the server. That's why we use the getUser function. And we check for every route if the user is meeting the requirements to actually see those routes. And in some of those situations, it requires the user to be logged in. So those are the 5 pillars of authentication in a project. And if you're building a SaaS, this is a must.
Okay, now that we have set up our authentication and we understand how authentication works, the next step is to build the core concept of the SaaS. So that could be a variety of different things. And that could involve, for example, using AI or not using AI. In this tutorial, we are using AI. We are building an AI newsletter. So the core concept of our SaaS, so the product that we're offering, right? Because SaaS is a software as a service. The software is that you are able to receive a personalized AI newsletter. And to do that, we're going to be requiring ourselves to actually execute a variety of different steps to get there. So what am I talking about? Well, first of all, we need to find a way to generate this newsletter. The way we're going to do that is we're going to use a news API to fetch data and articles for specific categories that the user select. So this is the website running, right? This is the website done, already running. This is the dashboard, and it's what we want to build. But most importantly, the core concept is that you can click on Update Preferences over here. You can select the technology or the category that you want to have your newsletter be, and then you can choose the delivery frequency. Now, it's a bit hard for us to test the delivery frequency because I would have to, it delivers once a day or once a week, so it's hard for me to show you guys the email being received. But I'm going to show you guys a way to actually test it going, and also show you guys a way to test this being scheduled as well. But the idea is when we fetch the data from the API, from the news API, we also want to then use AI, so use OpenAI in this case, to turn that into a newsletter. And then the third step is we want to send an email. So there's 3 steps of our workflow that are required for us to make this work. And the easiest way to do this is by using Inngest. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to set up Inngest for our project. So I want you guys to go in the description and click the link in the description, and then you should see yourself in this page. What we want to do is create an account. I already have an account, so I'm just going to sign in, and I'll be back in a second. Then I want you guys to go to this URL over here. It's ingestapp.ingest.com/env/production/manage/signing key. And I want to copy this signing key. Now I'm going to delete it after this video is posted, so don't even try using it. And what I want to do is I want to come to our .env file, and in here I want to paste the ingest signing key. Now this signing key is used to secure the communication between Inngest and our servers. So this is a very secret key that we don't need to share to anyone else. Now, the second thing we need to do is we need to install Inngest into our project. And to do that, it's actually very simple. I'm going to run npm install ingest. And when this is done installing, what we want to do is we want to start our Inngest dev server, which is a fast in-memory version of Inngest that we can actually quickly send and view events to see our functions working. Now, the way we do that is we run npx ingest CLI at latest dev. And you'll see that it will ask first if we want to install the Inngest CLI package. Then when we run this, it is going to start a local host inside of our computer on the local host 8288. I'm going to copy that and I'm going to paste it over here. And when I open it, this is what you see. Now, this is the Inngest dev server, and this is running completely locally. This makes it super easy for us to develop our functions locally without any framework, just using the dev server. Now, the whole point of Inngest is that it is an event-driven function framework that is designed for us to very simply build, test, and operate background operations, and having the dev server available to us makes all of that a lot easier. So the reason why Inngest is super useful for us, especially when we're building a SaaS using Next.js, is that, like I laid out to you guys, the core concept of the project is we have those 3 steps, right? We have to fetch the news API, we have to generate the data using AI, and we need to send the email. Now, not only that, but we also want to schedule those things to happen on the background, not as the users on the website. So Inngest makes all of that super easy for us. For example, if we wanted to do some sort of background work, like sending an email or processing an image, it's super easy to do this using Inngest because it is great for offloading long-running or non-blocking tasks without kind of blocking the UI. Also, the cool thing is that specifically in our case, we have 3 steps, right? We have to fetch the news API, we have to use the AI to generate the data, and then send the email. If any of those steps fail, Inngest actually has a built-in retry logic and error handling that will retry one of the steps until it succeeds. And if it obviously fails after a couple retries, it will show to us very easily what failed in that step in this dashboard over here. So it makes our life a lot easier because when you're working with a SaaS, usually there's a lot of steps in the core product that you're trying to serve, and you really want to keep track of everything that's happening. And also the retries is really cool. You'll see there's been situations in which for some reason something happens and one of the steps fail, and then on the second try it does work, and the whole process isn't failing for the user. It actually succeeds for the user. So we just set up over here our dev server, and what we want to do is we want to create what is known as an ingest function. And to do that, we have to set up our ingest client. So I'm going to come over here and I'm going to create a folder in our lib folder over here. Let's call it ingest. Then in this folder, I want to create another folder called functions. And I'm also creating a file called the client. Now in this client.ts file, we want to set up our ingest client so that we can use it everywhere else in our app. So we'll start by saying import ingest from ingest. Then we're going to export a const. We're going to call it ingest, and we're setting this equal to new ingest. Now we have to pass an ID for the app. We're creating a connection to this app. So I'm going to put an ID here called newsletter or AI newsletter app. Now we can call this client.ts file and have access to the ingest everywhere in our app. Now the second thing I want to do is I want to go to the functions folder, and in here I want to create a file called the functions.ts. Let me also just close all of this off so we have more a clearer view. So in this functions.ts, it's actually going to be very, very simple. All I want to do here is I want to register all the functions we have for ingest. Now we're going to export a constant called functions, and it's going to be an array. And every time we make a different function for ingest, we're going to pass it to this array. Now, what is an ingest function? Well, an ingest function is just a TypeScript or JavaScript routine that we will write that will run in response to some event in our app. So it's kind of like a background task that will only kick off whenever we need it. We can trigger it based on some event, like you press a button and we'll trigger it, or you can schedule it, which is important for our project. Now, we can have multiple different functions for different parts of our app. In this project, we're only going to have one function, which is the schedule newsletter function. But I like to make an array like this so that you can put all of your other functions inside of here in case you need them. Now, before we create our first function, we do have to serve our HTTP endpoints in our app for ingest. So I want to open up over here and create the API folder in our project. And in here, I want to create a route. This route is actually directly from the docs from Inngest. It's called the ingest route. And we need to make a route.ts file in here. So route.ts. Then inside of this file, I want to import the serve function from ingest/next. So it's from the Next SDK. Then we want to import the ingest client that we created in the client.ts file. And then we want to import all of our functions. Now, which functions are we talking about? Well, it is the ones that we created on the functions.ts file. So I'll go to lib/ingest/functions/functions. Then what I want to do is I want to export and set this equal to the serve. And in here, we just have to pass which client we're trying to serve, which is the ingest client, and all of our functions. This is how we actually get our functions to work. This is going to return to us the get, post, and put requests. And we need to make this into a const. Perfect. That's all we need to do for this route. Now we can close this and we can start building our route. Now, this is going to be a lot of backend stuff for a while. We're not going to do a lot of frontend because we're trying to build the core functionality. Now, the core functionality will look like this. We're going to create a ingest function over here. And in this folder, we're going to create the, we're going to call it scheduled newsletter. That's the name of the function. What this will do is we want to define a series of steps that will go from, we want to define a series of steps that when triggered or scheduled should execute the core concept of this website, which is fetch the news API, generate with AI the newsletter, and then send the email. We'll start with the first one, fetching the data from news. Now, we have to create our ingest function first. So I'm going to export default over here. And to create an ingest function, all we have to do is call the ingest client and call the create function. Now in here, we have to pass two things in the argument of this function. The first thing is an ID, which is just a way for us to identify which function it is. So we can call it something like this, like newsletter, and then scheduled. Then we want to pass an event name. Now, an event should actually go on a different object like this. And an event is a little bit more important than an ID. An event is the name of the event that will trigger our function. Now, if we want to trigger our function like from a button click or from a very direct step, we can pass an event. But if we want to schedule our function, we can, for example, alternatively pass a cron to specify the schedule that will trigger this function. For testing purposes, let's start by passing an event, and it's just a unique name that when we try to trigger this event, we'll use to know which event we're trying to trigger. So I'm going to call it something like this. I want to call it newsletter.schedule. Then the last thing I need to pass to the argument of this create function is an async callback function that will define how our inject function is. Now, this callback function gives us access to three things: the event, the current step, and the run ID. They're all super important. So let's start with the first, which is us wanting to fetch the data or the articles depending on the category of what the user chose, right? So imagine the category that the user chose. If we go to the full app, you can choose a variety of categories, and we want to pass that information down to that inject function to know which newsletter it's going to generate. So to do that, what I want to do is I want to define a step in our function. And to do that, we give it a name. So I'm going to call it all articles because this is what we're going to get back from the step. And we're going to set this equal to await step.run. So this is the first step of this. We give it a name. It's going to be called fetch news. And we'll make it into an async function and define what this step does. Now, what this step will do is it will fetch the articles based on the categories. Now, how do we know which categories we're going to the user chose? Well, we haven't built the front end yet to accept to pass the categories and to trigger this function. So we don't have that yet, but all of that is going to be passed through the event. So we're going to put as a default value over here. We're going to call it categories. We're going to just set an array with, for example, technology as one of them. The second one can be business. And then let's put politics. So those are the three categories we're putting by default, but later we'll pass the real ones. Then what we want to do is we want to use these categories to return a function called fetch articles. Now I'm going to make this into a different file. I'm going to make this fetch articles function in a different file so it doesn't clutter our ingest function, but we're going to pass the categories to it. And what it should do is it should request the news API, which by the way, you can find it in the description, and it should return the list of news or news articles. Now to create this fetch article over here, we're going to create a function here in our lib folder. I'm going to call it the news.ts. It's just the file that we're going to use to deal with the news API. And what we want to do is we want to create or get an API key from the news API. So I want you guys to go to newsapi.org, create an account, and get your API key. There's a chance it might ask for a credit card information, but the thing is they have a free tier, so it's a very big free tier and it's totally viable for this project. So even if they do require a credit card, you won't be charged for anything. So log into your account and I'll be back in a second. Now, when you sign into your account, you go to newsapi.org/account and you get your API key over here. You copy that and you should go back to your code, and we're going to go to our .env.local and we're going to create here a variable called news API key. We're going to set this equal to the API key that we have, and we can get started by building the fetch articles function. So I'm going to say export async function, create the fetch articles function. Then we're going to import this function here. Now we need to specify what the argument of this function is going to be. So we're going to say categories. It's going to be a string array. Then in here, what we want to do is we want to, in the end of this fetch articles function, return a promise, so a result of this request. And this promise will resolve, whenever it's done, to the following. It will resolve with an array. But the type of the array will be the following. It will be an array of objects in which each object is going to have a title, which is going to be a string. They're going to have a URL, which is going to be a string, and a description. So a description, which is going to be a string as well. Now I need to close this last part here of the promise. Now I have to remove this extra quotation mark over here in the promise, and I have to put a colon over here to say that this is the type. Now it's given us an error just because we're not returning anything yet. But I'll just return an empty object just to remove that issue. Now, what do we want to do here? Well, we want to fetch from the API the news articles from the last 7 days. So to get that information of it being the last 7 days, I want to create this variable called since, and I want to get the date time of 7 days ago. So we want the newsletter to be updated to the week, so that's why we want to make it into 7 days. I'm going to create a new date over here. I'm going to say date.now and subtract 7 for 7 days, and I'm going to multiply it times 24 for 24 hours, 60 for 60 minutes in an hour, and 60 for 60 seconds, and then 1,000 for milliseconds. And then I'm going to say to ISO string. And when we get that information, we want to pass that to the fetch request from the news API. Now, to make the fetch request, we're going to say response is equal to await fetch. We're going to use the built-in fetch API. And in here, we want to pass the following API request, or the following API URL. It's from the news.api.org version 2, and we want to fetch for everything. But we want to put a specific query in here. Now, what is the query that we want to put? Well, we want to query for a specific category. Now, we have here from the list of categories, different categories that we want to fetch articles for, and it might be more than one. So we actually want to make a request. You can only specify one category per request. So we actually want to loop through the list of categories by creating here a list called promises, and we're going to loop through the categories map. And for each category, what I want to do is I want to make this API request. So I'm going to make this async. I'm going to get the category for each items in the list, and I'm going to put this response inside of it. Now, what's going to happen is I'm going to insert or encode this category inside of here by using the encode URI component and passing the category to it. Now, the news API also allows you to specify from which date you want to fetch your articles from. And that's the whole point of why we created this since variable over here, to get the date time string for the timestamp of 7 days ago. So what we want to do is, after this query here, we want to add another query param to it, and it's going to be the from param. And we're going to insert the date since we want to get this. And after this, we also want to specify more. We want to specify that we want to sort all the articles by the publish date. So you can do that by saying sort by and then passing the published by or published at property, because that's a property of an article in the news API. And finally, for this API request to work, you need to directly embed here the API key that you got from the website. So we're just going to get the process.env.news API key. Perfect. And this should give us back the information. Now we do want to try and catch this. So I'm going to say try this, and we need to catch in case there's any errors. If there is an error, we want to just console.error this error so we know. So I'm going to say error. And I also just want to return an empty array. Now, in the response over here, we first need to know if the response was okay. So if not response.okay, then there was an issue with this request. So again, I want to console.error, and I'm going to say failed fetching for this category. And I'll just insert the category in here. And then I want to again return an empty array. Now, if all of this is okay, meaning we correctly fetch the data from the API, I can now just get the data by saying data is equal to await response.json. And I can map the data that we receive from the news API into a format that we defined over here, which is we want to return an object or a list of objects, and each object should have a title, a URL, and a description. So I'm going to come over here. I'm going to return, and I'm going to get the articles from the data. So I know how the format of the news API returns. I know it has an articles, and I'm going to just get 5 articles of it. So I don't want to get any more than that. So I'm going to say 0, 5, and I want to map through all of them. I'm going to get the article type over here. I don't know exactly the type. I don't want to define a model for it. So I'm just going to say any. And for each article, what I want to do is I want to turn it into an object with a title, a URL, and a description. Now you can take a look at the documentation for the news API to see any more other information you might want to feed the AI with. But in here, what I think might be good is just saying article.title. And if there's no title, I'll just default to a value here saying no title. Then URL, I'm just going to get the article.url. Again, I'm just going to default to like a hashtag so it doesn't give us an error. And the description, I'm just going to say article.description. And I'm just going to default it to no description available. Now, why do we put the defaults? Well, because we're going to feed this to the AI, so it's better to let them know if there's no title, nothing available. So great, now we should get this data back. Now, why is it giving us an error? Because of this return. So what I want to do is when we get back the promises from here, we want to actually return them. So I'll destructure all of the results. And since it's multiple of them, because we looped through the categories array, I want to create here results, and I want to use the promise.all. So promise.all, since it's an array, and I'll pass the list of promises. Then I want to just return a results.flat. So we get a flat array from it. Great. Now we have this part of this step of our core product that now is correctly running. Great. So now we get the list of articles. Now, I'm not going to test this yet. We'll see it working later on, but I first want to finish this function. And let's just assume that we are getting the articles back. Now, when we get the articles back, what I want to do is go to the second step of our function. Now, the second step is to generate the AI summary. Now, how do I generate the AI summary? Well, for this, we need to use some sort of AI model, which in my case, I'm going to be using OpenAI. So to generate our summary, you need to get an API key from OpenAI or from something like OpenRouter. So what I do is I go to openai.com, you log in to the API platform, and I'll just log into my account. I'll be back in a second. And then you can just create an API key on the API keys section of OpenAI. You go to platform.openai.com, you create your API key. It's the secret key that you see over here, and you can just copy it, and we're going to paste it on our .env file. Now to paste it, we're going to come here to our .env.local, and I'll just paste that information over here. Now make sure you call it OpenAI API key exactly like this, because Inngest will automatically infer this when we operate with OpenAI. So you need to make sure that it is the correct name. Now we'll go back over here into our function, and we're going to create a variable, which is going to be a result from this step. It's going to be called summary. It's where we use the articles that we got from the first step and we generate the AI summary. I'm going to await, and I'm going to use step, but instead of saying step.run, I'm actually going to use a special use case that Inngest has for AI, which is we use the AI and we say infer. Now, what is this? Well, it's a built-in helper that Inngest has that lets us call out to an AI model as one of our workflow steps. It's basically a run, but for doing AI inference rather than just running our own JavaScript code. And we benefit a lot from using this instead of just making a normal run and then just making the API call ourselves, because we don't even need to install the OpenAI library. It does it all for us through Inngest. So all we have to do is we give it a name. So I'm going to call it summarize news. Then we'll pass here the model in which we want this AI operation to be in. So we get that by saying step.ai.models, and then we choose which kind of models we want. We want OpenAI. And you specify which kind of model it is by passing the model variable over here. And for this video, I'm going to be using GPT-4o, but you can use it whichever one you want. I'm going to be honest, I've been testing this code for like over 3 days already, and I haven't spent even 5 cents. You can even use a free model if you want to as well. Now, over here, we're going to go to pass a body, and this body allows us to pass a list of messages. Now, if you're familiar with OpenAI, you should, or with making requests like this to an AI model, you know that this is super useful. The messages allow us to specify different roles and different content that we want to pass to the request. Now, this is super important for you to understand if you're going to be working with AI. Basically, when you're working with OpenAI's chat API, each message has a role that tells the model how to interpret its content. So in this video, there's 2 different types of roles that you should know of. First is a system, and a system message basically sets a high level behavior, or more specifically like guidelines that you want the model to follow. So for example, in our case over here, the first message that we're gonna send to the AI model is a message with the role of system, and the content of it is gonna be some guidelines that we think are super important for the AI to follow. So it's going to be stuff like this. It's going to be, I'm going to make it into backticks so that it's multiple lines as well. But this is what I have it. It says, you're an expert newsletter editor creating a personalized newsletter. Write a concise, engaging summary that is kind of like just the background information that you want the model to have. But then you also need to pass here the second message. And the second message will have a role of user. Now, what is a role of user? Role of user in a message basically says that the message represents the end user's actual prompt. So this is where we write our actual prompt. So whatever we put over here, if we say like write a, so if I put here a content and I said write a newsletter about, I don't know, the elections. I don't even know. There's no elections, but you know what I mean. So if I do this, then it's going to write a newsletter about the elections, but it is going to use all of the guidelines that we determined over here. So basically, the role for system sets the instructions, and the role for user tells the AI what they want, what they need to do. So obviously, we're not going to tell it to write a newsletter about elections. What we want to do is we want to specify that we want to use the information from the articles to write those newsletters. So this is how we're going to do it. We're going to say create, and I want to use backticks for this as well. I want to say create a newsletter summary for these articles from the past week. And I want to put here the list of categories that I requested, right? So I requested categories that were based on the list of categories that we got from, oh, it's a list that is inside of here. So let me actually bring this out so we can use it over there. But let's grab the categories list over here. And I want to insert it here. And since this is a string and categories is a list, I actually need to join them. So I'm going to join them based on this comma, and I'll put a space in between them so that the AI knows which categories of articles were requested. Then I want to put some more space, and I want to specify that based on those categories, here are the articles. And I need to be very careful with how I paste the articles, right? We're getting them from this API request over here, and it's a list. So what I want to do is I want to insert all the articles, so all articles, and I want to map through them. Now for each article, so article of type any, I want to get also the key for each of them, which would be of type number. And for each of them, I actually want to render a string. Now, what is the string? Well, the string is going to be the index plus 1, because I want to specify which article is which, and the key over here, which is, I'm going to call it index, so it makes more sense in the context of an array. But the index for this item plus 1 would be like the actual order of it. So the first article would have an index plus 1 of 1, the second one would have 2, the third one will have 3. And then I'll put a dot, so the AI knows that I'm listing out this item. Then I want to put the article title, so I'll insert the article.title. I'll create a new line, and you can do that by using this /n over here. And when I create a new line, I want to insert the actual article description. So article description. And below this article description, I want to insert a new line, and I'll put the source. So I'll say source, and I'll put the URL. So we'll say article.url. Perfect. And then I'll put a new line as well. Okay, so this might be a bit confusing, I understand, but we're basically just making it look in a way such that the AI would understand. If we get 3 articles, in the end, this string will look a bit like this. It will have 1 dot, because we made this. We'll have the title of the article. Let's imagine the title is World War III started, something like that. And then we have here the description, which would be the actual article, and then finally this source, which would be the link of the website. So this is what we're doing, and then it would have another list at the bottom, which start as 2 instead of 1. So this is the bottom line. We're just generating that based on the articles, and this should help us generate the actual newsletter summary. Perfect. Now, in the end of this, when we get all of the articles, right? When we map through all of them, we want to join them to actually insert them into the string. So I'm going to join them, and I want to join each of them based on a new line so that each article has a new line after it. Perfect. Now, after we're done with this, we get the information back, so the summary back, and we will be able to get this information. So I'm going to say console log, and we can get back the summary dot choices, and we can get the first item, then say dot message dot content. This is how you actually get the information back from a request to OpenAI. Now, before we do the last step, which is the step for the sending emails, I feel like it's a good time for us to go back and start building the UI so that we can actually test this out. Now, this means that we're going to leave this for a while here at the state that it is, but we're going to come back later and see what happens from this console log to see if it's actually working. So let's go ahead and start building this page. So what we want to do here is let's go to the app folder, and we want to create a folder for the dashboard. We already have one over here, but we're not really doing anything here. Now, what we want to do is we want to build the structure of this page such that it has obviously the title, it has the explanation of how this newsletter works, but also it has the information about what your current newsletter settings is. And to do that, we have to store this information somewhere. So where are we going to store that? Well, we're going to store that in Supabase.
So in here, we don't have any tables yet, so we need to create one. So we're gonna go here to the SQL editor, and we're gonna click on New SQL Snippet. Now, we're gonna be writing a PostgreSQL code directly inside of here, so that we can make our tables very quickly. And this is what we wanna do. We wanna create a table called User Preferences, and this table will have a variety of different columns. The main columns that we'll always have in tables is the ID column, the created at, and the updated at. Now, the columns that we want to have that are specific for our project are the following. So when you create a user preferences table, it stores the user's preferences for the newsletter. So it starts, for example, which categories they chose the AI to summarize, the frequency they want to receive this on their email, their actual email, so we know where to send this information, and also who are we sending this to. So we need to have a user ID that correlates to the user ID that exists in our users table. Then also I added the ability for us to pause the newsletter. So I could click here and you'll see that it will deactivate the newsletter and it will make it inactive so that we don't actually send the emails. So we need to start that information as well through this Boolean called isActive. So with this, we're going to click run and it should create our table. You see now our table should appear over here and it has all the columns that we defined. Perfect. Now let's go back to our code and let's start building the UI. So in order to start this, we're going to start by building the skeleton of this page. So I'm going to put 3 divs so that this section over here is the title section. So we're going to have an H1 tag that says your newsletter dashboard. Then we're going to have a P tag that is going to say manage your personalized newsletter preferences. Then we can save this. We go down a div, and below here we can start building the grid-like structure for the current preferences. So we're gonna start by saying we'll make another div here, which will have an H2 tag, and it will say current preferences. Now we don't have that data yet, so I actually want to put already the state in which we go to whenever you don't have your preferences selected. So here's how it's going to look like. We're going to have a link from next link, and it's going to say something like this: no preferences set yet. And it has a link to the select route, which we're going to create to set up your newsletter. So now we can move forward with this. We go down to divs and we want to put the actions in this page. What I mean by the actions is this buttons over here. So you can update your preferences, you can pause your newsletter, or manage your subscriptions. So to do this, what I'm going to do is I'm going to add a div, and it's going to have an H2 tag that is going to say actions. Now below this, we're going to add another div, which is going to have a button. And on this button, we're going to have an SVG. And on this button, we're going to have the following SVG. As you can see, it's just the SVG that represents like what you're trying to accomplish. So it's this SVG over here. And we're also going to add a text saying update preferences. Now the actual preferences and other buttons that we have over here, we can't really do them because again, we don't have the preferences information. We don't have the idea of whether or not the current preferences for the newsletter is active or not. So we actually want to set that up first. To do that, I want to redirect the user when they click on this button over here for updating the preferences, and I want to redirect them to the select page. So we haven't made the select page yet. Let's do that right now. Let's create a folder over here in the app folder, call it select, and make a page.tsx. And on our dashboard, what we'll do is when you click on the update preferences button, so we'll add an on click over here, we're just going to redirect the user to the select route. So to do that, we have to get the use router hook. So let's make this into a client component, use client, and then I'm going to say const router is equal to use router, make sure it's from next navigation, and we can now call the router.push to redirect the user to the select page. So if you see over here, when I click on this, we get redirected to the select page. Now it's giving us an error because we haven't built the select page yet. So I'm going to close all of this and let's start building the UI for this. Now, what do we do here in the select page? So I'm going to export default function. I'm going to call it select page. And in here, we're going to return a div. We're going to build a structure for it. So another div with another div. And in this div, we're going to put the title of this page. So something like this, customize your newsletter. Now this page is this one over here. When I click update preferences, we get to this page. It has a bunch of options you can select and choose the delivery frequency as well. So I'll start already by adding some of the CSS so that we don't have a black page and you guys can see everything better. So this is the CSS that we're adding. It makes the page white and it looks a lot better. So you can just copy the styling if you want to, or again, you can go and copy it from the description, or you can also not put the styling yet and just let it be how it was before. Now let's add a p tag over here. This p tag will just say, select your interests and delivery frequency to start receiving personalized newsletter. Now we want to build a form for the category selection. So we'll build a form that will accept both a category that you select and also the delivery frequency. So we'll go below here and we're going to add this form. Inside the form, I want to add a div to encompass the whole section, but more specifically, the category section. So we're going to define this form with two sections. First is the category. The second one is the delivery frequency. So for the category section, I'll make this apparent over here. What we want to do is we want to put a title and a description to what this section is. So we add these two texts, first the title, a smaller one than the major title that we have on this page, and a smaller paragraph tag that says choose your categories and select the topics you would like to see in your personalized newsletter. Now below this, we're going to add a div to actually display the categories. Now we don't want to write manually each of these categories. You notice these are checkboxes. You can select them like this, but it's annoying to create, I guess like 9 categories. I think that's all the ones that you can select. I also just noticed that on this website that I made, I wrote categories wrong. So we'll fix that in this portion. But what we want to do is we actually want to make an array that will contain the name and the description of each of the categories. So we will go up here, actually above the component in case we want to have access to those as well elsewhere. We're going to create an array called categories. And in here, we are creating an object for each category. We'll give it an ID. The ID is actually the name we want to store in our database, not the name that is displayed here. For example, the first category will be technology. We can say technology as the ID, and then we'll pass a name, which is the actual text that will be displayed in the screen. So we'll pass technology. Finally, we want a description. So for the description of this one, we'll say latest tech, I wrote this wrong, latest tech news and innovations. So we'll do this for each of them. I obviously already did it. So I'm just going to copy and paste, and you guys can copy the same ones if you want to. These are the categories that we want in this project. Now, there might be more categories in the news API. If you want to add them here as well, feel free to do so. But I feel like these ones are the main ones that people would want in a newsletter. Now, what do we want to do with these categories? Well, we want to map through them inside of our UI. So inside of this div over here, let's loop through the categories. So categories.map. We'll grab each category plus the key. And for each of them, we're going to render the following. We're going to render a label that is going to include an input inside of it. Now, what is this input going to be? Well, the input is going to be of type checkbox. And you see that now we get 9 checkboxes. We also want to pass the key to this label. So I'm going to pass key here, and I'm just going to pass the key directly. And below this input, we want to put a div that will include another div, which will include some UI changes depending on whether or not we selected this or not. So you see that when I select this, there's a lot of stuff that changes in the individual category that we selected. So we want to have a way to determine if the user selected a category or not. So the way we're going to do this is we're actually going to create a state up here, and it's going to be called selected categories. So we'll say selected categories, and we'll create a function called set selected categories. It will be a use state, and the type of this state is going to be of type string array, because you can select multiple categories, not just one. Now, it's telling us that it's an issue because we need to turn this into a client component as well. So we'll say use client. And now what I want to do is I want to change the value of the selected categories array whenever the user toggles one of the checkboxes. So the way we're going to do this is we have this input on the categories, right? It's a checkbox. So on this input, we can actually pass on change over here that is going to be called whenever someone toggles this specific checkbox. Now this is inside of an array, so we don't know which checkbox it is. The only way to know which category is associated to this checkbox is through the category ID. So we're going to create this function called handle category toggle. We're going to call it that. And it's going to be a function that is going to handle adding this category to the selected categories array whenever someone toggles it, and removing it when someone toggles it from being active to being inactive. So in order for us to know which category it is, we're going to pass to this function the category ID. Perfect. Now we just have to create this function. We're going to do it up here. So we'll make a function called handle category toggle. And remember, it requires a category ID, which is a string. And below this, what we want to do is we want to set the selected set categories. Now we'll get the previous values, so we know what the current list of selected categories is, and we just want to alter whatever checkbox we are clicking, not the other ones. Then what we want to check is we want to check to see if this list of selected categories already includes the current category ID. Because think about it, this list will be the list of categories that are active. So if I select this, this, and this, these three categories should have their ID in this select categories list. So if we are clicking it to deselect it, we want to know if it's already in the list, so that instead of adding, we actually remove it. So the way we do this is we get the previous state, we check to see if it includes the category ID. And if it does, we know that we want to remove it. If it doesn't, we know we want to add it. So we'll add here the functionality for removing it. To remove an item from a list, it's very easy using the filter function. So we'll filter for this specific item. We'll keep everything else but the one that has the category ID equal to the one we passed in this function. So we're going to say filter, we'll get the ID, and I need to make sure that this has the correct parentheses. And if the ID is not equal to the category ID, we keep it. So that's what we're filtering for. But if it doesn't include the category ID, it means that we want to add it to the list. So we'll come over here, we're going to put the else case, and to add something to the list, you just use the common destructor and pattern. You make a new copy of this array, you add all of the items from the previous array, and you just add the new category ID to the end of it. The full logic should look like this. And now as we select this, it should be keeping track of which ones we selected on the state. Now it's obviously not visual, but one thing we can do to make it visual is we can actually make the value of the input only show, not value, the checked property in a checkbox only show if the selected categories includes the category ID. That way we know that it is only the ones that you're really selecting, and if you're not selecting them, then, because like if I were to change this, you'll see that now I can't even select anything because we're not actually updating the state. Because it is actually showing that it's a check mark, means that we are updating the state correctly. Perfect. Now what we want to do is, instead of this div that we created over here, I want to put the category name. So I'm going to say category.name. So we see all of the names directly. And then we're also going to add another div with the category description. So category.description. Now the UI is very ugly right now. We can't really see stuff. So I'm going to add the CSS to this entire section over here, and I'll be back in a second. Okay, so I just pasted it over here. As you can see, this is how the code looks like. I'll try to make it visible for you guys, all of the classes. We added classes for everything within this div. And also we added some cool logic. For example, to differentiate between the background color and the border color of the sections that we are selecting, we embedded the notion of whether or not the category selected inside of the class name so that we can change the class names in Tailwind depending on that. Also, I specifically used, as you can see over here, a specific checkbox SVG. So we added this little checkbox icon. This is not the default one. We did this over here. Below the input, you want to add this whole div over here. And this is above the category name as well. And it just has this SVG that you can copy. It's just an checkmark SVG. You can get anyone available out there. And yeah, this is the styling for the bottom categories as well. And it looks pretty good. Now, what we want to do is we want to list down here the amount of categories that we selected. So we see here, as we select, it just increases the number. Obviously, we want to spell it right, but that's beyond the fact. And this div is going to have the following functionality. So it's going to check to see the length of the amount of categories we selected by just getting the length of the selected categories. And if it is equal to 1, it will just add a y to the end of the word category. So it says 1 category selected. But when we go above 1, you see that it switches to categories. It's just a minor string manipulation so that we can get the proper wording. So as you can see, we can select multiple categories and this information will update. Now we are pretty much done with the category section. We want to now add the frequency section. So I'm going to add here, similar to what I did with the category, I want to add a frequency section label. And inside of this div, we want to start by adding an h2 tag. I'll just copy and paste like I did with the category. Just add it directly over here. It's just going to say delivery frequency and how often do you like to receive this newsletter. And we want to do something very similar to what we did with the categories. We'll add a checkbox, but this is not a checkbox. This is a radio input. So the way we're going to do this is I want to add a div below this. We want to create a list of the different frequency options similar to what we did here with the categories. So below the categories list, we're going to create another list called frequency options. This list will have an object extremely similar to what we have for categories. It's going to be the same thing, but the ID is going to be what we store in our table. So if you remember, when we created our table for user preferences, you saw that we made it such that the frequency type is actually one of the following options. It can either be daily, weekly, or bi-weekly, because those are the options we're going to add over here. So the ID of the frequency option has to match exactly how the state or the text is written over here. So we want to make sure that the ID, for example, for the daily option is like this. But what is displayed for the user is something else. It's going to be the name. So we're going to capitalize this, and the description will be just like every day. Now we want to do this for the weekly and the bi-weekly. Obviously, I already have this set up, so I'm just going to paste it over here. And it should look like this. Now, since we have the frequency options, here's what we want to do. Inside of this div that we just created, we want to loop through the frequency options. So frequency options.map will get each frequency and a key for it. Then for each of the frequencies, we want to render a label, similar to what we did above. Now on this label, we want to put an input that is going to be of type radio. And you'll see that now we should see the Next.js button over here kind of blocks it, but we should see 3 little radio buttons. Now we obviously want to do a bunch of styling to it as well, but we'll just start with adding the ability to keep track of this. All of the logic is very, very, very similar to what we did with the selected categories, but instead it's going to be called selected frequency. And it's not going to be an array because you can only select one frequency. So we're going to change this to obviously selected frequency, and we're going to change this to be just a string. Initially, it's just going to be daily, because I think that that's the default option. Actually, no, I think the default option should be weekly. Now, we want to have a way to select the frequency. Because it's a lot easier to select the frequency compared to the selected categories, because it's just a string, it's not an array of strings, we actually can just do it directly over here. We don't need to make an extra function for it. So in this input over here, what we want to do is we want to add an onChange. And on this onChange, whenever you click on this radio, we'll set the selected frequency to be the ID of this frequency. So when I select this one, like, it can't actually switch the values. Now, currently it's allowing us to select all of them, and it doesn't allow us to deselect them. And the reason for that is because we don't need to add a toggle functionality to the state declaration here, as long as we pass a checked property and make sure that it is only checked if the selected frequency is equal to the frequency.id, because then it's going to switch the values every time you click on a different one, and it's going to deselect it and not allow you to select multiple at once. Now what we want to do is we want to add a div over here, and this div will have another div that will basically use the selected frequency boolean, or the selected frequency value technically, to determine if we create this radio circle. Now, similar to the checkbox, we're not using the built-in UI for that, which right now is like this. It's just a couple circles. We're actually going to make our own, so it looks a little bit better. It looks like this. So what we want to do instead is we want to add another div that will only show up if the selected frequency is equal to, not select page, the selected frequency is equal to the current frequency .id. So if the current frequency is the one selected, then we want to add this self-closing div. Now, the important part of it is that we're going to add some class names to this to make it look like an actual circle. This will be the inner part of the circle. It's going to be this little circle down here, as you can see. So how do we make that happen? Well, first, I'm going to add a div below this section, just to encompass this. And I'm going to replace this with the following logic. What I want to do is, this will become a self-closing div. I want to make it into, as you can see, we have now double the amount of circles. I want to replace the original one with this new version. And now the way we make the new version is through this div over here and this class names over here. Now we have to remove the previous one, the original circle that comes with a radio input. To do that, we pass a class name from Tailwind called sronly, and you can see that it will remove that as well. Perfect. Now let's add the labels to each of the frequencies. So what we want to do is we want to come down two divs down here. We want to add a similar structure to what we did here with the category divs. We're just going to copy that and we're going to paste it here. But instead of adding category, we're going to add frequency for both of them. So frequency.name and frequency.description. And you'll see that we'll get both of them as well. Now I'm going to add the class names to the remaining things. The first class name that we need is we need to set a margin bottom to this section over here. Then we want to make the div above the frequency options map be a grid-like structure. So I'm going to add the following class names. And then I want to use the key directly on this label. So I'm going to say key is equal to key. And I'm going to add the class name onto this label. It's the same as we had before. So it kind of looks like what we did for the category. Now, I also want to pass a name property to this input. So when we submit the form, we know which one it is. We did the exact same thing here on the above one. And now we successfully added the styles for the delivery frequency section. The last thing we want to do is just add the final description down here, which is the number of categories selected and also which day you selected and the save preference button. So to do that, I'm actually going to just copy and paste it over here to make it simple and quick for us. Now to do this, I will pretty much just copy and paste here since it's pretty much what we've done so far. What I added here is the section here for adding the name, the category like we did above here. But also I want to add the following. I want to add a space after the selected to also show the current selected frequency and how many times it's going to deliver. I want to also add an empty space. To do that, I'll do this. So there's an empty space in between this icon over here. And now we have the Save Preferences button that is disabled until we select categories, as you can see. That's what we did with the option. So it's not actually fully disabled. We actually probably need to, it's just a styling. We probably need to come over here to this button and add a disabled property and just make it be such that if the category.length is 0, then it means we didn't select anything. So it's disabled. Perfect. Now we pretty much finished the UI for this section. All we have to do now is build the infrastructure such that when we submit this form, it will actually insert the data into our table. So how do we do that? We want to add the data to this table over here that we created, and we want to do that immediately when the user submits this form. So the first thing we need to do is we need to create a function, and more specifically an async function called handle save preferences. So this function is going to take in an event, which is going to be a form event from React. And when you call it, it is going to submit this form. So I'm going to say event.preventDefault, so it doesn't refresh the page when the form is submitted. Then I want to check to see if the selected categories.length is equal to 0. Now, technically, the button should be disabled if there's no selected categories, if you didn't select anything. However, if they try to force submitting the form, we need to gate through this. So I'll just alert a message saying, please select at least one category. And I'll return out of the function. Now, we also want to check the user information, especially to check to see if the user is logged in. So I'm going to call the useAuth hook, and I'm going to get back the user info. And with this, we want to check down here, similar to what we did with the selected categories, we want to check to see if the user is not logged in. If there isn't a user, we need to alert a message saying, please sign in to continue. Now, technically, we shouldn't even be reaching this stage if you are not logged in, but if there's somehow an issue, we want to gate through that as well. Then I want to actually operate or execute the functionality. So I'm going to do a try catch, and I want to catch for potentially any errors. And instead of this try operation over here, we're going to make an API request to a route we're going to create in our API that is going to serve the user preferences. So I'm going to create here a folder. We're going to call it user preferences, just like this. And it has to be actually outside of the ingest folder. It has to be in the API folder. Sorry about that. And then in here, we want to make a route.ts and make our first route in this project. So what route do we want to make? Well, I want to start by making a post request. Now, why are we making a post request? Well, because we're going to insert data into a table. So it makes sense for us to make that into a post request. So this post request is going to look like this. It's going to have a next request type. And we'll start by grabbing our Supabase client. So I'm going to say Supabase await, and I'm going to call the create client function. Make sure you import the server version. Now, what we want to do here is we're going to send data from the front end to this API route. And the data we're going to send is data that is important for us to know when we're inserting into the database. More specifically, we need to know the categories the user chose, the frequency in which they chose, and also the user's email. So to do that, what I'm going to do is I'm going to assume that when we make this request, we're going to send that through the body. We're going to start by getting the user info to see if they are logged in. Remember that it is better to call this in the backend through the auth.getUser because it actually validates the token. And we get that information like this. We get the data, and then we can access the user. If the user is null, it means the user is not logged in. So we'll add a check over here to see if the user is logged in or not. And if they're not, we'll just return an error saying that you must log in to save preferences. Then below here, we want to try to get the information from the body. Remember, the body is going to be the email, the preferences, and the categories. To get data from the body of the request, we await the request.json. Then we want to destructure that info from the body. So I'm going to say set equal to body, and I'm going to get the categories, the frequency, and the email. Again, make sure you make it, when we pass it, you have to pass it with this exact name in the object. Then I want to make 2 validation checks. The first one is going to be the validation to see if the user passed categories and if that's not empty. So it looks a bit cluttered, but this is what we're doing. We're just checking to see if the user passed categories. And if they didn't, we're just going to return an error saying that categories array is required and must not be empty. Same thing with the frequency. Not only we check to see if the user did pass a frequency value in the body of the request, but also that it is part of the options that we set up over here. So it's either weekly, daily, or bi-weekly. So if there's an issue, we say error valid frequency is required, and these are the options. Now, after this if statement, what we want to do is we know that we have valid frequencies, we know we have valid categories, and we know that we have a valid user. So might as well try to insert the data into our database. But one thing that is important is we're not just inserting data into the table. The user can then update their preferences every time they want. So this is the real project, right? The finished project. We can update our preferences and that can change it. So if I click here and I select this stuff and then I click save preferences, it makes those changes. Now that's an update request. And if you don't have a preference to start with, it's an insert request. So there's this really nifty function in Supabase called upsert, which is it's an update or an insert, depending on if the data is there. Meaning if the data is not there in the table yet, then this will become an insert functionality. But if it's there, then we'll just update the data that is already in the table. So the way we do this is we say const, we set this equal to await Supabase, and we specify what table we're trying to make changes to. In this case, it's the user preferences table. Then we call the upsert functionality. With the upsert functionality, we pass 2 things. First, what data are we trying to update or insert? And second, what is the column that will be used to identify any conflicts? Now, what do I mean by any conflicts? It means if I go to our table over here, when I insert a new user preferences, how do I know if there is already an existing user preferences there if I'm trying to just save or make a change to it? Well, each user will only have one user preference entry. So this user ID field over here is what helps us determine if we're trying to insert a new row into this table or just update an existing one. So what we have to do is we have to pass here an onConflict value, and we pass the field that determines that onConflict. More specifically, the user ID field. Then on this upsert functionality here, we pass an object that will contain the data. So what are we trying to pass? Well, when we are inserting to the user preferences table, we need to pass the following data. We have to pass a user ID, a list of categories, a frequency type, an email, and an isActive. So you might have already imagined what each of them should represent. The user ID, we can get it very easily because we have the user type that we got from the Supabase auth, and we can say user.id. Then what we want to pass is the categories list, which again, it's super easy because we already have those categories passing through the body. Then we want to pass the frequency. Again, we already have that, so I'll just pass the frequency. And finally, the email, which we also get from the body of the request. Actually, we do have to pass as well the isActive, but the isActive defaults to true. So we're just going to say true because when you insert the data for the first time and you update your preferences, you want to turn the newsletter into an active newsletter. Now, we want to get any errors that might have happened behind this. So I'm going to get this error object over here, and I'll change the name of it to be upset error. Then what I want to do is below this, we want to check to see if there was any errors. And if there was, we want to console log it and return a next response with a generic error saying failed to save preferences. Obviously, we don't want to specify the error in case the user is looking at their network tab. We'll console log it for internal debugging so we know what happens. Now, in the end, if there wasn't any errors, we want to return. Now, in the end, if there wasn't any errors, we want to return a next response.json that will return an object with the following data. We want to let the front end know that it was a success. So I'll say success is equal to true. We also want to know a message. maybe saying something like this: preferences saved and added to table, or something like that. And with this, we can now call this API route and try to add the data into our table. So let's test that out. Let's come to the page again where we have this try and catch. And here we want to make a request to our backend. So I'm going to say const response is equal to await fetch. And here we're going to specify the route to that request. It's going to be /API/user-preferences. Then, since this is a post request, there's a lot more that we have to pass here. First thing is we need to pass the method and specify that the method is post. Then we need to pass the headers. The headers is just going to be application/JSON. Finally, we have to pass the body, which, remember, we promised we were going to pass a body with a categories list, a frequency value, and an email. So to do that, we actually need to turn this into a JSON stringify, because when you send it through a post request, you need to send it like this. You're going to stringify it. And then the object will look like this. We need to pass a categories property, which will be equal to the selected categories in this page. Then the frequency object is going to be equal to the selected frequency, whatever the user selected. And the email is just going to be equal to the user email in our front end. So user email. If there is any errors, we want to alert a message saying failed to save preferences. Please try again. And if there was a success, we know that by saying if not response.ok, then we actually want to throw a new error saying failed to save preferences. Then what we want to do is, why did I get this? I scrolled all the way down. Let me go back up here. If this is done, we'll just alert a message saying your newsletter preferences have been saved. You will start receiving them soon. And then we want to redirect the user. We don't have access to the use router hook here, so let's actually do that. Const router is equal to use router. And we want to redirect the user back to the dashboard. So router.push, we redirect them to the dashboard. Now, let's call this handle save preferences when we submit the form. So I'll come up to where we have the form, and this form will look like this. We'll have an on submit, and we'll pass the handle preferences directly here. Now let's test this out. You see there's no data in this table. When I come to our selection over here, let me select, I want to have technology, science, and politics, and I want it to be every week. So I'll click save preferences, and it seems like it's taking a bit. Is it running infinitely? Is there an error? Let's check our table. So there's definitely an error. I'm going to check to see what happened, and I'll be back in a second. Okay, there wasn't an actual error. It was actually I just restarted my dev server and it worked. So here's what we have to do. Let's click save preferences. We got the alert. We click OK. We get redirected. And if I go here, you see that we added this new preference to our table. Now, what happens if I try to change it? If I go again back here and I change it to something else, I click save preferences. It doesn't add the data to the table. It just updates the data that was already there. So great. This functionality is working perfectly. Now everything is great, right? Well, no, because the whole point of why we stopped what we were doing with the ingest function to make this section, it's because this is now the best opportunity for us to start testing our ingest function. Because remember, with this ingest function that we made over here, for us to call it, we just have to send an event or trigger this event over here, the newsletter schedule. So somewhere in our project, to trigger all of this functionality, we have to trigger this event. And when you save your preferences, that's when you want to trigger it. I mean, technically, since this is going to be a schedule thing, meaning we want to schedule it every other day, depending on the user's preferences, it's not going to be a trigger immediately. We're going to queue the request and set it to a schedule. But in our case over here, for testing purposes in the beginning, we're actually going to try to trigger this and try to actually generate the article. So how are we going to do this? Well, in our post request over here, after we insert the data and we know that it wasn't an error, and before we return back the request to the user, we want to try sending this request or triggering the function from Inngest. So to do that, it's actually pretty simple. We have our Inngest client, and we can just await the Inngest client that we have, and we can call the send function. With the send function, we can specify an event that we're trying to trigger, and we give a name to it. Now the event is the newsletter.schedule, so we're just going to pass that over here. And then we can pass any data that we want to pass to this event. Now over here, we don't have any data we're sending yet. Actually, we did everything kind of manually. We even specified that the user wants the categories to be just this. We're not actually passing it from here. But this is not a problem because by just calling this, we can actually test to see if our function is working. So let's just do that. Let's run this API request now that we're sending or triggering this event. And let's open up our Inngest development server. So if we open this, you see no runs happen in the previous hour. Now, if we go over here and we update our preferences, it is going to reach this stage over here and it's going to trigger this event. And now that we have this send functionality here, we can successfully trigger our event. But the last thing we need to do before doing that is the following. First, let's add an ending to this function from Inngest by just adding a return statement here to return an empty object. We'll obviously add stuff to this object later on, but for now, just for testing, we'll do that. And also, if we were to trigger this functionality right now, it wouldn't actually trigger the run. It would register that we triggered this newsletter schedule event, but it wouldn't trigger this function. The reason for that is because we never passed this function to our list of functions over here, because we created this to register the functions. It's an array of functions that whenever we create a new ingest function, we'll just put it over here, but we never did anything with it. So what we have to do is at the top over here, we have to import, and let's give it a name. I'm going to call it scheduled newsletter function. And we're going to import that from @/lib/ingest/functions/functions. And no, it's actually not /functions/functions. It's going to be /scheduled newsletter. And then I'll pass this value into this array. And now we should have registered this function. And when we run this, it should actually appear in our Inngest development server. So if we go over here, you see there's no runs to be found. But if I go to my website over here and I now try to select a couple things, make a change, and I click Save Preferences, you see we did save the preferences, but most importantly, we should now see this running in our Inngest development server. So you see each step of our workflow is actually being displayed over here. So first we fetch the news. And as you can see, it was a success. We can easily see the result of it, as you can see on the right, but also very easily see the duration and the delay that it took to happen. And then the second step is to summarize the news. Same thing, we can see what we passed as the payload to it, and we can see the output. And the great thing is, if I go now to our code over here and I open up the console log, we see that we successfully generated our newsletter. At least it doesn't look like it's not visual, but we see a console log with articles for the different categories that we selected. So we know for sure that our ingest function that fetches articles from the news and then uses AI to summarize it is working. And I hope that you already realize how great the Inngest development server is, because look how easy it is for us to easily check to see each step of our run by just clicking on the different options. Also, it didn't show here, but if we were to, again, have an issue with any of them, for some reason the news API reached a limit, or maybe it was a bad request, or they're just having issues, it would show as a little red step over here, and it would keep retrying. And now that we know that it works, we can continue building our infrastructure. So the last step of our core product is that we want to actually send emails. So I left that for last because right now, just knowing that we can generate the email using AI and fetch the articles is good enough. The emails is actually something that is a bit different because it requires a lot of like nuances. It depends on what library you're using to do this. More specifically, we're going to be using email.js, and there's a bunch of different libraries that you can use, not libraries, but services that you can use to send emails very easily in your project. I've personally worked with a variety of them. I've worked with email.js, I've worked with MailChat. There's different options. Obviously, none of them are sponsoring this video. I don't vouch for any of them. But I like using email.js just because it's very simple, and I've used it in multiple videos of mine. And it's also very free in the sense that for the purposes of this video and for this project, you don't have to pay anything. So we're going to be using email.js to send email to our newsletters. So in order to set this up, I want you guys to go to email.js.com, or again, click the link in the description. Here, you'll need to create your free account, or just sign in if you've ever used this before. When you sign in, you'll find yourself in your account. Now, if you go to the email services section over here of the dashboard, you'll see this page, but yours will probably not have Gmail like mine does, because this is an account that I use for testing, and I already set up Gmail for it. Basically, what you want to do is you want to add a new service of which you're going to be sending the emails from. So you choose whatever email you have, whatever service you have for this. Personally, I chose Gmail. You put here, and then you give it a name, and it will have a service ID. Make sure you keep track of that service ID. And then you click on Connect Account. When you click on this, it will ask you to sign in with your email that you're going to be using to send this email. So in this case, if we were building this as a real company, we would probably buy a domain for this website and create an email for that domain, and then send the newsletters from that email. Now, when you connect that, you should see just like this, where you have a service ID and you click on the Create Service button. But again, I already have that, and I need to keep track of that service ID. Now, what else do we need? Well, let's go over here and let's go to our .env file. And in our .env file, I want to add 3 more environment variables. I want to add the email.js underscore service ID. Then I want to add the email.js template ID. And then I want to add the email.js public ID, or the public key. Now, when I add the 3 of them, we need to get them at different places. So what the service ID is the ID of the service we're using, right? So which email we're sending our emails from, and you get that ID from here. So we'll copy that and we'll just paste it over here. Then the template ID is actually pretty important. When you send the email, right, we're sending our newsletter, we need it to actually be a templated email that has a specific format. So what we want to do is we want to go here to email templates. And again, you shouldn't have anything here. I have a contact us page from a previous project, but you should click on create new template. And as you can see with email.js, you can select a bunch of different templates that they provide to you. I mean, it's for different common situations in which you might want to send emails to your users. But obviously for us, we're going to have to massively customize it. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to choose here the contact us template, and I will just click create template. Also make sure that you choose this one, because the ones that have a star right next to it are actual templates that come with paid features. So we're making this completely free. We're customizing it ourselves. So go to the contact us and click on create template. Now, obviously the template will have to completely change it from what it is right now. Right now, it's literally just having this subject title. Instead of it, we should say something like this: your personalized AI newsletter is here, or whatever. If you want to generate a title, you can do that as well. And then make sure you keep the stuff on the right the same. So other than the fact that since we are trying to send this to the person who wants to generate the newsletter, instead of having this email, which is the email I use for this account, as the to email, we want to put this over here. This is going to be a variable that when we call the email.js API, we're going to pass it. So I'll copy and put it over here, and it will represent the user's email, the email that we're trying to, for the user who's requesting the newsletter. Now we need to create the content for our email. So I want you guys to click here on edit content, and there's 2 ways you can do it. You can use it with the design editor, which is like you can use like a Google Doc as if you were using an actual text editor, or you can use it, you can edit it through HTML. We're obviously going to be using HTML because it allows the most customization. Now, I already have the HTML for this email, and the reason why I won't show myself writing the HTML, it's just pure HTML, like there's no other part of it. The reason why I won't show it is because I want you guys to make it however you want. Like, make it look however you want. It's pure HTML where you can add CSS like this. Again, I'll put a link directly to this email template because it's not going to be in the code base, so you guys can access it as well. But as you can see, just HTML, has a body. You can apply the styles through the style tag. And then down here, here's the important part. This is the main body of the email. It's this part over here. So we have the title, the header, right? With the personalized AI newsletter, your daily dose of curated news. And then the important part is the fact that there are some variables that we inserted over here. When you make the API request to email.js, you are actually able to send some data in the request. And you can specify what kind of data you're going to send. We created here variables that we're going to send from the backend or from our website, right? And when I make this request, I need to make sure that I send with the request a categories value, an article count value, a current date value, and most importantly, a newsletter content value. So categories is actually just the list of categories that were chosen by the user. So I have here an example of how this newsletter might look like. This was me just testing around, and it generated like this: categories, sports, environment. The articles count, as you can see over here, is just the amount of articles that were analyzed to generate this newsletter. And the generated on is just the date in which that happened. So those are all things that I think are important, but you don't really have to do it. And then here is the newsletter content, is the actual newsletter that was generated using our AI. Now, one major difference as well you might have noticed, and this is a part that you might actually have issues with, is notice how in this variables over here, we're using 2 curly braces. And on this one, we're using 3. That is because in email.js, if you want to embed HTML inside of the HTML, you have to use 3 curly braces. If we don't, if we use 2, then the HTML that we send from our website to email.js will be rendered as text. And it would end up looking a little bit like this. So this was me testing around when I first made this website, and I realized that I wasn't embedding the HTML correctly. So make sure you put 3 variables instead. So now we're going to close this up, click apply changes. We now have this beautiful section over here. And what I want you guys to do is go to settings, and you can see that now on this template, you have the template ID. I can also change this to something like AI newsletter and just copy the template ID, save everything, and let's go back to here and paste the template ID here. Perfect. Now we just need our email.js public key. To do this, we're just going to go to account and get our public key, the public key from API keys. Then we're going to paste it here, and we're going to save our file. Now we're ready to send the email. So we have here we're just console logging our AI generated summary. But instead, what we want to do is we actually want to convert this result into HTML. So if we look here on our terminal for a generated article, you might have noticed that this isn't HTML. This is Markdown, which is a different type of language. It's basically what we use for our READMEs. As you can see, our READMEs have an MD extension, and all of this is written in Markdown. So we have to convert this result over here from the AI request into Markdown. And the easiest way to do this, in my opinion, is to use this package, which allows you to do that. So the name of the package is called Marked, and we're going to install it. Then it's as easy as just creating here a variable. We can call it HTML result, and then set it equal to marked. And marked is the function that will take in some markdown and it will transform it into HTML. So we can just put this here directly. Now, actually, before I put that directly, I want to check to see if that's not null. So I'll create a variable here called newsletter content, set it equal to this, and then I'm going to gate this. If there's no newsletter content, then I want to throw a new error that is going to say failed to generate newsletter content. Let's remove the console log. We don't need it anymore. And now we can just pass the newsletter content to the marked function. Now it says cannot find name marked because we didn't import it. So we'll just import it from the package. And perfectly, now we have the result. Now what we want to do is we want to create a new step in our run. So you see here we have the first one, which is to fetch the news articles. And then we have the step for AI generation. And now we're going to have a very similar thing to what we had here with the articles, but we're going to have the email step. So we're going to come down here and we're going to say await step.run. We're going to put a name for this step. We're going to call it send email. And it's going to have a callback async function that is going to actually execute it. Now, similar to what we did here with the articles, I want to keep this logic outside of this function just so we abstract everything. So I'll create here another file similar to what we did here with the news file. I'm going to create a file called email.js, not JS, TS, sorry. And in this file, I am going to create an async function called send email. And in here, we will write all of the logic from getting all of the environment variables we have set up in our env file to calling email.js and sending the email. Now let's just call this over here. We're going to say await send email and import the file. Then we need to install the email.js package. Now there's a couple packages that you might be prompted to install if you go to the documentation, but most times you're gonna install the email.js browser, which is the version that you need to use in the client. But we're running this on the server, right? We're running this in our ingest function, and more specifically, we're having it in this file over here. So to have this work, we have to install the Node.js version of the email.js package. So I'm gonna say npm install at email.js/node.js. And when that's installed, we can just come up here and import email.js from at email.js node.js. Perfect. Then what I want to do is I'll come down here and I want to create a variable called the template params. What are the template params? Well, when you call the email.js to send an email, which you can do like this, you can await email.js and call the send function, which then sends an email. It requires 4 things that you pass. So the first thing is the service ID, which we don't have right now, but we can get it from our environment variables. The second one is going to be the template ID. The third one is going to be the template params. And then the fourth one is going to be a mix of a public key and a private key, which I'll do in a second. Before we build the template params, let's just get here the service ID, which we already have. So this error goes away. We're going to do this by saying process.env.email_js_service ID. And then I'm going to copy this and paste it 2 more times. Actually, 1 more time for now. And we're going to say template ID and then just change this from service to template. Perfect. Now you see that we get an error over here, and that's because we have to gate it beforehand. But also, did I name the variable correctly? Let's go to the .env file. I didn't. Yeah, I didn't. So it's not email.js with an underscore. It should be like this. We need to check and assert that they are real variables that we got from our env file. So I'm just gonna strong assert it. Then for the template params, here is where we specify the variables that we want to send from our client to the email.js API. So what I'm talking about is all of the variables that we put in this template over here. So we have to pass, as you can see over here, a categories property, an article count, a current date, and a newsletter content. But not only that, we also need to pass the name of the user and the email. Now, I just noticed here, the name, actually, it's the from name. So we can change this to say something like AI newsletter generator, or whatever the name of the company you are building for this SaaS is. And then we definitely have to pass the user's email, right? So I'm going to save this and let's go back over here. Now, how do we pass those variables? Well, in this template params over here. So now for the template params, we want to pass the variables here. I'm going to start with email. Email is going to be equal to the email of the user who wants to schedule the newsletter. So to get that information, we actually need to get it as an argument of this function. Now, when we call this function in the scheduled newsletter, we need to have access to the user's email, but there's nowhere here that we do that, right? Even the categories here, there's nowhere we are actually passing info when we call this function. We call this function over here, but we never pass any data. So what I want to do now is actually transition and actually send data from this data field over here and use it inside of our ingest function. The easiest example of this is, for example, if we go here to our route and we have our data here. Now, if I want to pass the categories, I can just pass a variable here called categories, and I'll pass the value for categories that we get from the body of this request. Fine. Now, how do I access this in our ingest function? Well, it's as easy as us coming here and saying event.data.categories. And this name has to match whatever you passed through the data. Now we have access to the categories through the event variable. We'll do the exact same thing down here with the send email function. So in the send email, we're going to pass a couple variables. For example, let's assume that we're going to pass the email from the user. Now we don't have that yet in the data here, so let's pass that directly from here. We have the email from the body of this request as well. Same with the frequency, which we'll do later. But with the email, we can pass it into the send email function. In here, we can now add the email as one of the arguments, and we now have access to it. What is something else that we might want to pass? Well, we might want to pass the categories as well, because we list out the categories in our email.js template. So how do we do that? Well, I'm going to add here categories, which is a string, even though it's a list, but it's going to become into a string when we pass it. And in here, I'm going to pass the event.data.categories. But remember, categories is a list when we pass it from here through the ingest function. So what we want to do is actually we want to join this list by using the join function. The join function gets a list and joins all of the entries of that list separated by a string that you pass as argument to it. Now, the way we want to describe it is we want to display it with commas in between each of the categories. So we're going to put a comma and a space here, and now every element in these categories is going to be separated that way. Now, what else can we pass here? We obviously, let's just put it directly here. Let's put the email and the categories, but we also need the article count. That's a field that we specified. So article underscore count. And what is the article count over here? Well, we analyze all of the articles using AI, and to analyze all the articles using AI, we actually fetch all of the articles first, and we store it in this variable called all articles. So what we do is we get all articles and we pass that to the argument of this, but we pass it just the length of it, because that's the amount of articles that were analyzed by our OpenAI model. And over here, we'll create a variable here called article count, and we'll set it to be a number. Perfect. Now, I think there's only two things extra that we need to pass here. So we need to pass the current date, which actually we're not going to pass that through the argument of this function. The current date is easy to get in any JavaScript or TypeScript project. You just basically set new date. And since we want to display it in a readable format as a string, I want to convert it to a local date string. Perfect. And this should return the current date when you send this email. Now, the final thing is we need to get the HTML content. Now, the HTML content is actually going to be the newsletter content. That's how we called it in email.js. And we'll pass this as an argument to this send email function as well. It's going to be a string, and we can get it directly from here. And in here, we can just pass the newsletter content directly through the HTML result. Perfect. Now it's saying it is not assignable to a parameter of type string. Do we have to await this? Yeah, perfect. Now that we're done with this part, we can go back to the email and actually use that information. We already set up our template params. That's great. But the last thing we need here in our send function is we need to pass a public key and also a private key. Now the public key, we got it already. It's in our env file. So I'm going to come here. I'm going to create a public key variable. So public key, and I believe we called it email.js public key. So I'll just paste it here. But we actually also need to create another variable. We need to create the private key. I forgot about this. So let's create here the private key. We get this also from email.js. We go to our account and we can just copy this. Now I need to make it visible. Again, I'm deleting this account after the end of this video, so don't even try to copy mine, but I'll paste it over here and we'll create a version of this that is going to be called private key. And we can again copy this and paste it over here. Perfect. Now for the public key, we'll just do this, and for the private key as well. Now we're done with the send functionality, and we can test to see if we actually get it working. Because we're not scheduling it in any way, shape, or form right now, we're basically just sending the email immediately, as you can see, because we call this step, then we shouldn't have any issues and we should receive this immediately as well. So let's go here. You see I'm logged in with this email over here. I'm going to click on setup newsletter. I'm going to choose a couple options and I'm going to click on save preferences. Your newsletter preferences have been saved. You will start receiving them soon. I'm going to go to that email, which is this one over here, and I'm going to wait a second to see if we receive it. While in that, I can also check to see how this step is running. We'll see if we get to the last stage, which should now be the send email stage. And yeah, I'll be back in a second. Perfect. So it seems like I just received the email. As you can see, same time. I didn't fake this email. Also, you can see the send email step is over here, part now of our ingest function. When I click on this, we get a beautifully generated email with all of the current news. So at this step, you might even want to stop the project if you're interested in just making something like this. But if you want to learn a little bit more about how to schedule this kind of emails and a little bit more about ingest functions, here is what we're going to do. We're going to set up the dashboard of our website to be able to allow us to pause and continue the newsletter, as you can see, on top of updating our preferences. And we're also going to create a schedule such that you send the emails not immediately, but rather every day at a certain time. More specifically, I chose it to be at 9 a.m. Depending on the frequency you choose. So that's what we're gonna do now. So to do that, let's start by building the UI for this, which is something we left for a while. I'm gonna close all of these and let's just open our dashboard page, not the select, the dashboard page. And right off the bat, let's think about what is missing in here. Obviously, there's a bunch of UI missing, but also we're missing the data that we need to check to see what the user's current preferences is. So every time I update my preferences, it should show here the new categories, the frequency I chose, my email, and obviously the status of it as well, and when it was created. So to do that, we have this data, we have this table, right, on Supabase, and we have this endpoint called user preferences. This endpoint so far only has a post request in which we're adding those preferences and then obviously sending the data in the ingest function. Now, what I want to do instead is I want to make a simple GET request that is going to retrieve the user preferences and then return that data back to the dashboard page. So to do that, I'm going to export async function. And we're going to create a function which is a get request. It's going to take in a request and a next request as an argument. And in here, we need to get the Supabase client. So Supabase is equal to await create client. Then we want to get the current user because again, we want to validate with this user in the backend as well. So I'm going to say Supabase auth.get user. Then in here, we're going to grab the data and grab the user inside of it. I already have a validation here for if the user is not authenticated. So I'm just going to copy that and I'm going to paste it over here. Then what I want to do is I want to try and catch something. So let's start with the try and then we'll go with the catch. For the try, I want to get from Supabase. So I'm going to say await Supabase. I need to specify what table we're requesting information from. So I'm requesting it from the user underscore preferences table. Then we need to specify what columns in this request, in this table, we're trying to fetch. So it is going to be all of the columns. I want everything back. Then we need to specify which row in this table we're trying to get the data for. Now in this table, we're going to have a user preferences for each user. So we're trying to get the row in which the user ID matches the user of the user currently logged in. So in here, we're going to pass the user ID field and we're going to pass the user.id that we get from Supabase to that field. Then we want to specify that we want to get it. It's a single request. And when we get this data back, I'm going to create here a data variable. I'm going to call it preferences. And I'm going to get an error variable, which I'm going to call it the fetch error. Now with this, I want to validate for that fetch error. I'm going to say if fetch error happens, then I want to return. Do I have an error message over here already? Yeah, I'll just return something very generic like this. And it will say failed to get preferences. Now, if that doesn't happen, then I'll return a next response that is going to include the preferences as the return value. Now, in the catch case over here, it's going to be similar to this fetch error. We're going to return as an internal error. So I'm going to say internal error, and I'm going to just get the error here. And if I want to, for example, know what the error is, I can console the error to myself so I know what's happening. Perfect. Now we have this get request, and I just noticed that we're technically not using this request in the argument, so I don't even need it. So I'll remove that. And now in our dashboard page, let's make the request to get that information. So to get this request, I'm going to come up here and I'm going to create a state that is going to hold the preferences data. So we're going to make this get request and we're going to alter the preferences state to be equal to whatever data we get back. So I'm going to set it to an use state. I'm also going to create a type for it, which is going to be initially no. Now this type is going to be called user preferences. And the user preferences will look like this. It will include the categories, the frequencies, the user email, an isActive property, and the created at. And all of these should match whatever we get back from the database table. So I'll pass this here. And I also want to possibly accept null as a value since initially there's not going to be any preferences, so the value is null. Now, what I want to do is I want to run a use effect that is going to fetch this data. Now, of course, if you want to improve this project, you can use something like a use query or RTK query, any other library that helps you with data handling and data management. But for simplicity reasons, I'll just fetch the data in the use effect. It's as easy as us creating here an async function called fetch preferences. And then in here, I'm going to say const response is equal to await fetch. And since we are inside of a client component, in our fetch request over here, the URL that we pass to our own API doesn't need the HTTP localhost, the full URL. You can just pass the /API/user preferences. So directly pass the name of the route. Then when we get this data back, we're going to say const data is equal to await response.json. And finally, when we get that back, I'm going to set preferences equal to the data. Now we need to call this function somewhere here so that it actually runs in the use effect. And now we have the preferences. And now we have the preferences data to do whatever we want with it. So I'll come here to the current preferences where we have this. We haven't set any preferences. And what I want to do is below this H2, I'm going to add a check for this. I'm going to say preferences. If it's true, then I'm rendering some UI. And if it's false, then I'm going to render this section saying no preferences yet, set up the newsletter, which we had before. So I'll do this. This should be fine. And then I just need to pass something for here. So we want to put a div inside of here. Perfect. Now inside of this div, what we want to render is this over here. We want to render the categories first with the list of categories, then the frequency, email, status, and so on. So to do that, we'll start with adding the div that will have the categories. So for this div, I'm going to add an H3 tag that is going to say categories. And then I want to add a section below this where we're going to add another div. And on this div, we're going to loop through the list of categories. We get that from the preferences and we can map through them. And for each category inside of here, so I'll make the category variable and I'll also get the key. For each of them, I want to render just a span that will be that little pill that just has the category name in it. And I'll also pass the key as the value to this. We should now see that the category that this user myself chose, right, should now show up over here. Of course, it looks kind of ugly, but the ones that I showed up are appearing here, meaning that we are correctly fetching the data. Now, why does it look ugly? Well, because there's no styling to put some space in between them. So we're going to do that in a second. Before, let's just continue building this structure. So what I want to do now is I want to add the other three parts. I'll add them quickly since I already showed you guys how to add the categories. We want to add the frequencies, as you can see over here, which we can get by saying preferences.frequency. Then we want to add the email, which we can again get from saying preferences.email. And then this one is a bit different. We're going to get the status. Now the status is simple as well in the sense that we just render everything like normal. But then in the preferences, you know that there is an isActive, which is a Boolean. And all we're doing here is we created a div, which is supposed to represent this little circle over here. And if it's active, we just make the color of this div be green. And if it's not active, we make it be red. That's all we're doing. Same thing with the text right next to it. This text over here. If it's red, if it's active, we make it say active. And if it's not active, we change it to inactive. That's all we're doing. And then finally, what we want to do is add the created at, which is just getting the value for created at and transforming it into a date and then localizing it so that it looks like a real date. Perfect. So here it is. Now, why does it still look super ugly? Well, we haven't added the UI, the styling for a lot of the beginning of this. So I'm going to add some of this styling and I'll be back in a second to show you guys. Perfect. As you can see, this is the same structure as before, but I just added the class names. And as you can see, I'll scroll down so you guys can see all of them. And yeah, that's pretty much it. We haven't added for the actions yet. We'll add that after we're done building the skeleton for it. But this is how this page should be looking like right now. So we correctly show all of the information and the UI looks pretty good. Now what we want to do is add the other section, which is this one over here with the actions. Well, here's the thing. We currently don't have the ability to pause the newsletter. I mean, the backend ability of doing that. And update preferences obviously just takes you to the preferences table, right? Or the preferences page. So right now we're just going to build the UI for it. And to do that, what we're going to do is in the actions section over here, we want to already replace the portion that we have here, including the update preferences button, with some styling. So I'm just going to copy and paste it here. You'll see that now this is how it looks like. If I go here, it just actually makes it look like what we want it to be. Now to add these other buttons, what we do is we technically only want to add those buttons. So add the button for the, oh, I got signed out of this one, but you know what I mean. I only want to be able to add the button for the pausing and resuming newsletter if the user has any preferences. So I'm going to gate this by saying if preferences are true, then I want to actually check to see if the user has a preference that is active or inactive. So I'll do preferences.isActive, and if isActive is equal to true, then I want to render the following. I want to have this button that is going to say pause newsletter, and it will have a specific style to it, which makes the border of it be red and the background color of it be red as well. Now you won't be able to see it because we have to put an else case to this isActive statement over here. And the else case is very similar. I'm just going to put a colon here, and I want to render the case in which we want a button to resume the newsletter. So this is how it would look like. It's pretty much the exact same thing, but the text obviously changes to resume newsletter, and the color of the background of the button changes as well. So this is how it should look like. It should say pause newsletter, and obviously if this was the opposite, if this was inactive, so I'll just force it by making it false, you see we have the resume newsletter, which is green. Perfect. Now we have the functionality for the update preferences technically working. All we have to do is re-edit. I'll just come here, click on click. And then when I click on this button, I just want to push the user with the router to the select page. That's all we want, right? You click on here, you go to the select page. But what about the pause newsletter stuff? Well, this one is actually a bit different because in the pause newsletter, we want to make a request to our preferences table and make an update on it so that one of the rows changes the value of the isActive from true to false or from false to true. So how do we do that? Well, if I go here into our route where we have the user preferences, and in here we want to make a route that is going to update a specific piece of data in our table. Now, listen to what I said. I said update a specific piece of data, not replace it. So a lot of people might expect us to come here and create an async function that is going to be a put request. But that's not correct because a put request technically means you're replacing the entire data, and we're not trying to replace an entire row. We're just trying to update its value, a part of its value, which is the isActive over here. So in that kind of scenario, actually using a patch request is way more in line with the purpose of the method. So we're going to be using patch for this. And for this patch request, I'm actually going to copy a lot of what we did for the get request over here, just because of its similarities. The main difference is that we do need a request here because we need to access the body. So I'm going to say request is equal to next request. Then after we get the user, we're going to, instead of this try catch over here, we're going to say const body is equal to await request.json. And when we make this patch request, we want to send the value for isActive. So what is the value that we want isActive to be? So if it's true, currently we want to pass isActive equal to false in the body of this request. And if it's false, we want to set it equal to true in the body of this request. And then inside of this Supabase method over here, instead of saying from user preferences selected, we want to actually update it. And with the update function in Supabase, you just pass one value to it and it will only update that field. So we're going to update the isActive field, and that's the only thing from the table we want to update. Now we do want to specify which row we want to cause this update, or else it will update every single row with this, which is not what we want. So to specify, we want to update the row in which the user ID is equal to the user.id. Perfect. Now we don't really need anything back other than possibly the error, which we're going to call it the update error. And I'll just send a generic message saying failed to update preferences. And in the response, it doesn't really matter. I'm just going to return it saying something like this, like success is equal to true. Now we can close this up and let's go back to our dashboard. And when we click on the resume and pause newsletter buttons, we want to call a function that we haven't created yet. So on the isActive over here, let's create a button or a function that is going to be called handle deactivate newsletter. And we want to call this one when it says pause newsletter. Then we'll copy this, we'll go to the second button, and in here, we're going to create another one called handle activate newsletter. Now we'll come to the top of the component and we're going to create both functions. So async function handle deactivate newsletter, and I'll do the exact same thing for the activate. So handle activate newsletter. And for the deactivate, let's start with that one. What we want to do is we want to make a fetch request just like this. And what we want to do is we want to make a fetch request just like this. But in this fetch request, we have to specify the method is going to be patch. Also, the headers are going to be application /JSON. And then the body, we need to pass an isActive property. So we're going to pass a stringified version of an object through the body, and it's going to contain the isActive property. And that property, at least in the handle deactivate function, is going to be set to false. Now, we then check to see if the response was okay. If the response was okay, then we assume that this worked, and we are going to update the UI to reflect that. So we're going to update the preferences to, instead of saying active, it should now say inactive. So I'm going to say set prev. I'm going to first check to see if the preferences are null, because if they're null, then we want to keep them as null. But if they're not, then we want to return an object that keeps everything else from the preferences the same, but the isActive property is now false. Perfect. Now let's copy this entire logic, paste it over here, and just change this to true and change this to true as well. And then we could technically just make one function and just pass an argument, but I already did this like this. But if you guys want to optimize this, maybe just pass an argument to this function with true or false, and then just call the same function. But at this point, let's test to see if this is working. We're going to come over here. I'm going to click on pause newsletter, and boom, now it's inactive, and that's the data that is saved. Then I click resume newsletter, and now it's active. Perfect. Now, obviously, this isn't causing anything really, because the newsletter isn't actively scheduled right now, but this will be very useful later on. Now that we have this set up, how do we set up the scheduling for our emails? So that's an important thing that we need to understand, because there are two different ways in which you can schedule a function in Inngest. And the difference for the use case in your project matters a lot. So the first way is through what is known as event-based scheduling, which is when some sort of functionality is scheduled for a specific timestamp and it's triggered by a specific event. This makes it very flexible because you can specify very easily what kind of scheduling you want, like exactly when you want a function to run, and you have to specify when the next timestamp is for this function to run every time you run it. Now, the second type is cron-based scheduling. And cron-based scheduling is very common. Usually, it's when you want a fixed schedule regardless of the event. It is better for stuff like system-wide tasks that run at regular intervals, or if you have maybe like a Twitter bot that you want to run every day at 5 p.m. I don't know, something like that, right? But in this case over here, I think it's a lot better for us to use event-driven scheduling, which is very, very easy to do using Inngest. So what do we need to do here? Well, if you think about it, when the user sets up the newsletter, right, they click update preferences. For testing purposes, what I do is I just send the email immediately. But what I also want to do is I want to, after this, create another step in our ingest function that is going to schedule the next email to be sent. So what we do is we say step.run, and we'll call it schedule next. Then this is going to give us an async function that we can run. Now, to schedule the next run of this function, what we have to do is we have to get the current date. So we'll say const now is equal to new date. We want to create a variable that is going to represent when the next time this is going to run is going to be. So imagine this is 6 p.m. of Monday, right? And I want at 9 a.m. tomorrow for it to run again and send me an email if I chose in my preferences for me to receive my emails daily. So how do I calculate and tell Inngest that I want to run this functionality tomorrow at 9 a.m.? Well, I calculate the difference in time between now and tomorrow at 9 a.m. and I just schedule my function to run again at that time. And when I mean my function, I mean the whole thing, including the schedule next step. So it's kind of recursive, right? We're scheduling the next time this own function is going to run again. So we're going to create a variable called next schedule time, and it's going to be a date. Then I want to actually create here a switch because there are possibilities in which the user might have chosen for the frequency. So I'm going to switch between the frequency options, and if the user frequency was chosen to be daily, then I want to set the next schedule time to be equal to a new date. So new date. And to calculate it for tomorrow, I just get the current time and I add it to 24. I multiply it times 60 for 60 minutes, multiply it for 60 seconds, and multiply it times 1,000 for milliseconds. And this will give us the tomorrow, right? But the problem is that it will give us tomorrow at the exact same time as I decided to call and schedule this function, which is not what we want. We want it to run at a specific time, like 9 a.m. makes sense because it's usually when people wake up and then they read their newsletter. So what we want to do is, before we even write the other steps in this switch, we want to come here and set the next schedule time to have the hours of 9 a.m. And we do that by passing a 9, then a 0, then a 0, and then a 0. Perfect. Now, let's continue with this. Since we now are sure that it's going to run at 9 a.m., let's build the other cases. So I'm going to build the case in which the user chose weekly and bi-weekly. So weekly, here's what we do. We now get the time, but instead of just adding 24, we add 7 to it and multiply it times 24. This will represent 7 days, and this is just the time. This should perfectly align with weekly at 9 a.m. Then we want to do bi-weekly. So I'll get this. I'll change this to bi-weekly. Now for this, here's what I need to do. I need to add this with 3. Then I need to multiply it times 24. Because then it will run every 3 days, and it makes sense that it will be bi-weekly because, I mean, eventually it will end up maybe being 3 times because there's always a leftover day, but this is, I think, the order that I think makes the most sense. Then finally, I just want to put a default case in which it is going to just set it to the weekly because I think that that's the default value we passed. And I think we're good to go. Now that we have set the schedule for the next newsletter, what exactly do we have to do? Do we have to call the send email function again? No, we have to actually call this entire function again. Similar to what we did here in the user preferences, you see how we send the ingest function like this. we have to do the exact same thing. I'm going to copy that. I'm going to come down here. And after we set the hours, I want to send the newsletter.schedule function. Now, the data we pass here is going to be a bit different because they're not the ones that we're getting from the route. They're actually the ones we're getting from this function itself. So for example, the email we can get from the event.data.email. Then what else do we need? We need the frequency. Actually, the frequency is something that we haven't even passed on the top one. So we'll have to go back and do that. So we'll go to this route. We're going to pass the frequency here as well. And we have the frequency here because remember how we got it from the body of the request. So that should be fine. And here's an important thing. We want to schedule this function to be sent during this next scheduled time. So how do we do that? We have the timestamp for the next time it should run, and we have the operation telling it to run. So to do that, we can pass here a timestamp property to the send function and just pass the time for the next schedule time. So we'll say next schedule time, and we get the time. And what this will do is it will queue the run of this function until we get to this time. So with this, we're going to be able to actually set up the correct newsletter for our users. So let's test to see if this is working. Let's come over here and let's create a newsletter. So the easiest ways for us to do this, since we already set up our preferences, is to come here, click update preferences, and then actually select a group of preferences and choose the frequency we want. I'm going to choose daily since the default one is weekly, and I'm going to click on save preferences. We'll see that what happens is we're going to have an event that is going to start running, and that's because we receive an email immediately as a test for us to see how the newsletter will look like. And immediately when this one is done, we should then see another run being queued, and that one that is queued should only run at the timestamp that we defined, which is the next day at 9 a.m. And as you can see, that's exactly what happened. This one was queued, and it should only run at the exact time depending on what we set to be the timestamp down here. So perfect. All of this is working, and that's great. What is the last thing we want to do? Well, the last thing I want to show you guys is how to pause the newsletter, because I feel like that's another part of the main core concept. What we need to do is we have here the ability to obviously change the value in our table from is active to inactive. But is that really pausing the newsletter? Not really, because what it means to pause a newsletter is to cancel all of the outgoing currently queued runs that are going to be sent to the user. So in order to do that, we have to actually come here, and we only want to continue with this function over here if the user is active. So before we even fetch the news articles, we're going to come here, and we want to create a variable called is user active. We're going to set this await, and we're going to create a new step in this function. It's going to be called run. It's going to be called check user status, and then it's going to be async. And what we want to check here is, hey, for this specific user, check if their preferences says that their newsletter is active, because if it is not, then don't even continue further with this event. Now, that brings up a point which you might have, which is if we pause the newsletter and then we update the preferences, should it turn it on again? Well, I chose to keep the functionality such that no, you only return it. You can change your preferences, but it won't actually activate it. You'll only return it if you click on resume newsletter. You know what I mean? So now let's come back here and let's call our Supabase client. We're going to set this equal to await create client. And in here, I'm going to get the data and an error from a Supabase request to the user preferences table. Then with this, we're going to select just one of the columns. We're going to select the is active column. And then we're going to select the row in which the user ID
is equal to the event.data. And then when we send this event, we have to now pass a user ID. And then with this, we're going to select only a single event. We need to make sure we do that. And if there's any errors, of course, we need to throw them. So I'll just return false here. Actually, we can console log it if we want to, but I'm gonna be honest, I'll just return false. And then if not, we want to return the data.isActive. And if nothing is passed to isActive, we're going to default it to false. And why are we doing this? Because when we get this data back, we need to check if isUserActive is false, then we don't want to even continue further. Now, how do we not continue further? Well, you see this return statement over here. We can actually return data from our ingest function. It is really good for debugging and stuff like that, because if you come over here and you look at our runs, you might notice that the payload is great. You see, we're passing the data with the categories, the email, and the frequency, but look at the output. It's an empty object. So it's kind of hard to debug, and that's because we never sent anything back. It's good for us to return data that is used throughout the run for us to be able to know what happened, or even return data that might be used when you actually call this function. But since that is not something that we're doing in the project, we can just return either a empty object, or we could return, in the success case, something like this. We can return the newsletter by passing the, what did we pass for the newsletter content? We passed the HTML result. Yeah, HTML result. Then we can also pass the article count. That would be the all articles.length. And then we can pass the categories, which are the event. Actually, the categories, we already have that in payload, so I don't think that might be necessary. But what we can do is, when we get to this stage, we know that it successfully scheduled the next email, so we can pass possibly a value here for next scheduled, which would be true, meaning that we scheduled the next newsletter. Remember, this, in our case, is just being used for debugging when we look at our ingest dashboard. And in here, if the user is not active, it will return first and not actually do all of that stuff. So let's test that out. Let's come over here, and not this one. We can actually close that now. And let's come over here and click on pause newsletter. Then go to update preferences, and let's change something here. Let's change it to weekly and click save preference. You see that we should be able to start receiving them soon. But wait, it's already completed. Why is it completed? Because on the check user status, it was false, so we didn't actually start it. Now, the way we're going to start it is now when we unpause the newsletter, we're going to have to go ahead and schedule that back. So how are we going to do that? Well, let's go back here to the Visual Studio, and let's go to our patch request that updates the active status of the user. Now, after we check for the update error, and before we return the next response, and here we want to check to see if the user's newsletter is currently active. So we use the is active, and if it is active, then we want to cancel the events, and if it is active, then we want to cancel the current event. So for example, okay, so now let's test this. I'm going to click update preferences. I'm going to select some options, click daily, save preferences. And what should happen is we should see that it's running, and at any second we should see it being queued. Perfect. So when it is queued, we want to get this event. And whenever we click on the pause newsletter, we want to cancel it. If we are trying to re-add it or like restart the event, we don't want to cancel. We kind of just want to start the new sequence of scheduling again. We want to kind of start the new sequence of scheduling again. So what I want to do is over here, I want to, when it is active, I need to cancel it. And how do you cancel an event using ingest? Well, the easiest way to do this is in your ingest function declaration, you can define a cancel on property. This will require you to pass an array, and for each array, for each item in the array, you can pass an event name. So this is the name of an event that when triggered will cancel this function. So
we'll create here an event name, and usually I would rather call it something like this. I call it the name of the event that we're trying to cancel, and then I put .deleted after. And then what I want to do is I want to put an if statement over here. Then with this in mind, what we can do is we can come back here to the route, and when the user is active and they are trying to cancel their event, we can just await ingest.send and send or trigger the deleted event. So we can trigger an event with a name equal to newsletter.schedule.deleted. It is as easy as doing that. And you'll see now that with this event that is queued, if I were to come over here and pause my newsletter, it should have canceled this event. Now it didn't cancel, so there's something wrong. So let's go back over here. And what seems to be wrong is that we need to ensure that whenever we trigger the function, we want to cancel the correct event. So how do we do that? Well, what we can do is we can put an if statement over here. And on this if statement, we can basically match the events, the creation event, which is the newsletter.schedule, and the deletion event based on something that will help us make the connection between them. So what is the unique feature of an event? Well, the unique feature is the fact that the event should have the user ID being passed. One user should have one event. So like one user should have one scheduled newsletter currently running. So that's the unique identifier for them. So if we go down here, when we trigger the event, you see that we are sending the user ID as part of the data. Now, when we, on the post request here, we need to make sure that we are also sending the user ID in the data, which we're not. So we have to make sure we do that. So user ID, it should be user ID, .id, just like this. And now what this means is that we're going to compare the user ID sent on the creation of the function to the user ID sent when we want to delete it or when we want to cancel it. So here in the event that we're triggering for the deleted, we want to pass some data that will include the user ID. And that will be the user.id that we have from Supabase. Now, how do we say that? How do we tell the cancel on event that it should compare those two variables? Well, the easiest way to do this is on this if statement over here, you basically say async.data.user.id, which represents the data being passed on the cancellation event. And we say that that's equal to the event.data.user.id, which is the data sent on the creation event. And if this is correct, then let's actually create another event here. Save the data. Perfect. And it's running. I'm going to wait for it to queue. So I'll be back in a second. Perfect. So it seems to be queued and the user ID is passed. Now, hopefully when we click on the pause newsletter button, it will have canceled the event. It hasn't canceled. So let me go back over here and oh, okay, of course. The issue is that this should be the opposite. It should be when it's not active, then we want to delete it because the is active that we get over here is what we are trying to turn the newsletter into. So if it's false, it means we're trying to pause the newsletter. So let's go back over here and let's click, in this case, resume newsletter. So now it should not do anything, but then we click pause newsletter and it should now cancel that run. So perfect. We successfully canceled the run. If we were to create another run over here, so I'll update preferences and I'll select a bunch of them. I'll save preferences. I'll wait for the run to be done, or at least to be queued. And when that's done, I'm gonna click on pause newsletter. So as you can see, it was queued, and let's click on pause newsletter, and it was canceled. Great. Now, how do we resume the newsletter? Well, to do that, we'll put an else case over here. And on this else case, we want to access Supabase, which we already have, so it's fine. And what we want to do with Superbase is we want to get the user's preferences. So to do that, we're going to do this. We're going to get the user preferences directly from the user preferences table. we select only the categories, the frequency, and the email. And why are we selecting only those? Because technically what we're doing here is this step over here. We're restarting the schedule schedule next step of the main run. So the way we do that is we call, if you remember, we call the newsletter schedule function again, but with the new data. So we need to do that. We need to fetch the category, the frequency, and the emails. Then we need to do that for the specific user ID, which we can access by saying user.id. Then we're just gating for some errors. And what we do now is we copy this entire logic over here. We copy all of this right to the bottom. I think this is fine. And we'll just paste it down here. Now we'll get now we don't switch based on the event.data.frequency. We switch based on the preferences.frequency. And the categories are equal to the preferences.categories. The email will be preferences.email. Frequency will be preferences.frequency. And user ID will be the user.id. So let me just remove this. Perfect. And what should happen now is that when we try to resume the newsletter, it should actually start and queue a new run. And this run should continue, should be the exact point. It should run on the exact moment in which you should have had your next run. So like if you cancel this today and you were supposed to have your newsletter tomorrow, then this is what's going to happen. It's still going to run tomorrow at 9 a.m. So this is basically it. Now, there's obviously more than you can add to this project. I felt like I wanted to just show you guys how to build the main core functionality of this. And if you want to check another version of the project which has some extra features, I'll put the link for that in the description as well. If you enjoyed this video, please leave a like down below and comment what you want to see next. This was a bit of a different video. I decided to take a different approach with my teaching where whenever we're just doing a bunch of UI stuff, I just copy and paste, because some people have mentioned in the past that I should mainly focus on the core functionality of the video, which in this case is building the whole backend infrastructure. And also, I would like to thank Inngest for sponsoring this video. Now, I find that sometimes it's hard to give a non-biased opinion about a service that is sponsoring you. However, for Inngest, trust me when I say it made this project a lot easier. I can't imagine how hard it would have been to do all of this without having the Inngest dev server and being able to easily cancel events. That was great as well, because I've ran into having to cancel scheduled events in the past, and I didn't use Inngest for that, and now I'm happy to know that this is a better solution. So if you guys want to check them out, please click the link in the description. It will help support the channel as well, so I would be massively grateful if you guys could do that. Again, thank you so much for watching the video, and I see you guys next time.